For 35 years, Raymond Holt built a construction empire on one rule: build it right, and it outlasts everything they throw at it. Then he found a padlock on his own front door, and his name covered by a stranger's. His wife wanted a divorce. His most trusted man had stolen $3.8 million and framed Raymond for the theft. They forgot one thing: a signature from 1989 and the old man who signed it. "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." The phone rang at 5:45 in the morning, and I knew before I answered it. Not the way you know something when you've thought it through, weighed the odds, run the numbers. The way you know when 35 years of building things has taught you to feel a structure shift before it falls. The way your body understands what your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Cole's name was on the screen. My son didn't call at 5:45 in the morning unless something was already broken. I picked up. 3 words. That was all he said. "Dad, the server." I was out of bed before he finished the sentence. The Marriott on Camelback had given me a room on the 7th floor with a view of Camelback Mountain, which I hadn't looked at once in the 11 days I'd been living there. I'd been sleeping in 4-hour stretches, waking at 2 and 3 in the morning to read through the LLC filing Diana's attorney had sent, looking for the error I knew was there, the seam in the concrete where the pour had gone wrong. I hadn't found it yet. That was the problem with a lie built carefully enough. It looked like the truth until you knew exactly where to press. I dressed in the dark. Charcoal slacks, the white Oxford I'd had pressed the night before. The boots I'd been wearing to job sites since 1997. Not a courtroom suit. The hearing wasn't until tomorrow. Today was something else. Phoenix in November runs cold before the sun gets up. Not the cold you'd feel in Chicago or Denver, but cold enough to remind you the desert doesn't belong to anyone. I pulled onto Camelback Road at 5:58 and headed east toward the Holt Construction Group main office, the building I'd designed myself in 2003. 3 stories of steel and glass on the corner of Scottsdale Road. I'd poured the first foundation on that property on a Tuesday morning in August when it was 107 degrees, and the crew chief told me we should wait for a cooler day. I told him there were no cooler days in August in Phoenix. We poured anyway. The drive took 9 minutes. I'd made it 1,000 times. I could have done it with my eyes closed, and some mornings in the early years, when the business was young and the hours were brutal, I nearly had. I turned into the parking lot at 6:07. The lot was empty except for one truck I didn't recognize parked in the space marked reserved, a space that had said Raymond Holt on the curb since 2003. The truck was new, a black F250 with dealer plates and a Holt Construction magnetic decal on the door that someone had ordered and applied recently because the edges hadn't weathered yet. I sat in my car for a moment and looked at the building. The lights were off on the 2nd and 3rd floors. The lobby was dark. But on the front door, where the chrome handle I'd chosen myself caught the parking lot light, there was something that hadn't been there 11 days ago. A padlock. A commercial-grade padlock on a hasp that had been bolted into the doorframe recently enough that the paint around the bolt holes was still clean. I got out of the car. I walked to the door and looked at the padlock without touching it. Then I looked at the building directory panel beside the entrance, the one I'd had engraved in brushed aluminum in 2003 with the company name and the suite numbers. Someone had placed a placard over the top line. It was a printed card, laminated, fixed with double-sided tape that was already peeling at one corner from the November air. Holt Southwest LLC. Marcus Webb, Chief Operating Officer. I stood there for a long time, longer than made sense. The parking lot light hummed above me. Somewhere on Scottsdale Road, a truck downshifted for the light. The mountains to the east were beginning to separate from the sky, that thin line of dark gray against darker gray that means the sun is coming whether you're ready or not. 35 years. I'd started with a single cement mixer, a crew of 3 men, and a contract to build a 4-bedroom house in Chandler for a schoolteacher and her husband, who'd saved for 9 years to afford it. I'd built that house in 14 weeks. I'd built it right. The schoolteacher had sent me a Christmas card every year until she passed away in 2019. And her daughter still sent one now, because the house was still standing, and the family still lived in it. And they believed that mattered. I had 412 active employees. I had 28 projects across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. I had 37 years of supplier relationships built on a handshake and a track record, and the simple principle that you showed up when you said you would, and you built what you said you'd build. And I was standing in a parking lot at 6 in the morning, looking at my own name covered by a laminated card. I heard footsteps on the asphalt behind me. Cole came out of the shadow beside the building the way he'd always moved since he was a kid. Quiet and deliberate, like he was thinking through every step before he took it. He was wearing his work jacket, the canvas Carhartt with the Holt Construction logo on the chest. The one that was worn at the elbows from 3 years of crawling through framed walls and checking load-bearing specs on job sites across the valley. He was holding a small black drive in his right hand. He stopped beside me and looked at the placard on the building directory. His jaw tightened once, then went still. "I pulled everything last night," he said. Before he locked me out, too. He held up the drive. It was smaller than I expected. The size of a thumb, matte black. The kind of thing you could close your fist around and not know was there. I looked at it the way you look at something when you're not sure yet whether it's a tool or a weapon, or both. "How much?" I asked. "Everything," Cole said. 8 months of it. Every invoice, every wire transfer, every approval chain. 3,800 files. He paused. 3.8 million, Dad. That's what I can document so far. The parking lot light hummed. The mountains kept separating from the sky. Through the dark glass of the lobby, I could see the reception desk, the framed photos on the wall behind it. Project photos. Buildings we'd completed, bridges, schools. A hospital wing in Tucson that had taken 2 years and every ounce of skill we had. And on the far wall, past the reception desk, the wall I'd had painted the same shade of gray as the Phoenix sky in January. There was a framed photograph I'd hung there in 2004. 2 men standing on a dirt lot in the summer heat. One of them young, maybe 30, squinting into the sun. The other, older, holding a pen, leaning against the hood of a truck. The younger man was me. The older man had his name on the photograph in small letters at the bottom, because I'd written it there myself when I'd had the photo framed. Walter Briggs. I looked at that photograph for a long moment through the dark glass. Then I turned to Cole and said, "Come on, we're not going to the courthouse." Cole frowned. "The hearing's tomorrow. Arthur needs us to—" "I know when the hearing is." I looked at the drive in his hand. "But there's one name on that license that isn't mine. And without it, none of this matters." I turned and walked back toward my car. After a moment, I heard Cole's footsteps on the asphalt behind me. Cole spread the files across the hood of my car, the way a field engineer lays out blueprints. Methodical, left to right, each one overlapping the next by exactly an inch. He'd printed 12 pages from the drive before coming to meet me, the ones he said were the clearest. The ones where the numbers didn't need explaining. I stood across from him in the parking lot and looked at them in the early gray light. The invoices were real-looking. That was the first thing I noticed. Not amateur work, not something put together over a weekend with a template. Someone had taken time with these. The letterheads were for companies I didn't recognize, but the formatting was right. The language was right. The line items were the kind of thing you'd see on any legitimate subcontractor billing. Concrete supply, equipment rental, site preparation. The amounts were calibrated carefully, never large enough individually to trigger an automatic audit flag, always just under the threshold that would have required a second signature. 8 months of it. He started in March, Cole said. He tapped the first invoice. Small ones at first, 18,000 here, 22,000 there. By June, he'd found his rhythm. He moved his finger to a cluster near the center of the spread. These 4 alone are $460,000, all routed through the same LLC, Holt Southwest. Diana's LLC, I said. Marcus's LLC, Cole said. Diana's name isn't on the filing. I checked 3 times. I looked up at him. Marcus set it up himself, Cole said. 8 months ago, right when this started. The registered agent is a law firm in Scottsdale I'd never heard of. I looked them up last night. They specialize in asset protection structures. He paused. That's what they call it on their website. Asset protection. I looked back at the invoices. $3.8 million. Not all at once, not in a way that would have set off any single alarm, but steadily, patiently, the way water works through concrete. You don't notice water until the crack is already there. I'd built my business on being the man who noticed the crack. How long have you known? I asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. The way he got quiet when he was deciding how honest to be. 6 weeks, he said. I found the first inconsistency in September. A site prep invoice for a project in Flagstaff. The crew on that job told me they'd handled their own prep. Said they'd never heard of the company on the invoice. He straightened one of the pages. I didn't say anything because I needed to be sure. I needed all of it, not just a piece of it. 6 weeks. My son had been carrying this for 6 weeks. Coming to job sites, running crews, going through the motions of a normal workday with this weight in his chest. Waiting until he had enough to bring to me. You should have told me, I said. You had enough, he said. That was all. 3 words, the same economy of language he'd had since he was a boy. And there was nothing in them I could argue with, because he was right. Diana had filed the divorce papers in October. The board vote removing me from operational authority had come 2 weeks later. By the time Cole had found the first invoice, I was already living out of a hotel room on Camelback Road, reading through a marital settlement agreement that had been designed to leave me with nothing. He'd been protecting me the only way he knew how. By building the case. Okay, I said. I gathered the 12 pages and handed them back to him. He squared them against the hood of the car and slid them into the folder he'd brought. The drive went into his jacket pocket. The hearing's tomorrow, he said. Arthur's expecting us at his office by 3 this afternoon to go over the defense strategy. I know. So we're going to his office. No, I said. We're going to Tucson. Cole looked at me the way he'd been looking at me since he was about 12 years old. The expression that meant he was running calculations, sorting through what I'd said against what he knew, looking for the logic. Tucson, he said. There's a man there, I said. Walter Briggs. He's 74 years old, and he's been living in a house on the east side of the city for the past 11 years without a telephone that anyone seems to be able to reach him on. I leaned against the car. In 1989, I built my first house in Chandler. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, a back porch facing west so the family could watch the sun go down over the White Tank Mountains. I built it with borrowed equipment and a crew of 3 men who I paid in cash every Friday because I didn't have a payroll system yet. Cole listened. This was the other thing about my son. When he decided to listen, he actually listened. Walter Briggs was a licensed structural engineer, I said. 30 years of commercial and residential work across Arizona and New Mexico. He had a reputation for one thing specifically. He certified work that was worth certifying, and he refused to certify work that wasn't, regardless of who was asking or how much they were offering. There were contractors in this valley who wouldn't hire him because of that. Thought he was difficult. I looked at the building. I thought he was the only man worth knowing. "He certified Holt Construction," Cole said. "He certified me," I said. "That's different. The professional certification he signed in 1989 is attached to my name, not the company name. Without that certification, Holt Construction cannot bid on a single federal or state contract in Arizona. Which means, without Walter Briggs's signature on a piece of paper he signed 35 years ago, the 28 projects we currently have under contract are worth exactly nothing." Cole was quiet. I watched him work through the implications. "Diana knows this," he said. "Diana's a real estate attorney," I said. "She knows exactly what that certification means. Which is why before she filed the divorce papers, before the board vote, before any of this, she would have needed to know whether that certification could be transferred to Marcus." I picked up my keys. "And the only person who could answer that question is a 74-year-old man in Tucson who, as far as I know, hasn't returned a phone call in 11 years. I opened the car door. "How do you know he'll see us?" Cole asked. I thought about the photograph on the lobby wall. 2 men on a dirt lot in the summer heat. Walter leaning against the hood of his truck with a pen in his hand, squinting at the paper I'd put in front of him, and then looking up at me with those gray eyes that never seemed to miss anything. "I don't," I said. "But I know where he lives. Get in." Cole stood on the other side of the car for a moment, looking at the building one more time. At the padlock. At the placard with Marcus's name. Then he opened the passenger door and got in. I pulled out of the parking lot and turned south toward the interstate. The sun was just beginning to come up over the mountains to the east, turning the sky the color of old copper. Phoenix spread out around us in every direction. The city I'd been building in for 35 years. The skyline I knew, the way a man knows his own hands. I merged onto the I-10 westbound and then south, and the city began to fall away behind us. The density thinning out as the interstate stretched toward the desert. Tucson was 115 miles. We had time. Not much, but enough. The Sonoran Desert in November looks like something that has decided to survive on its own terms. Not green, not brown exactly, but a color somewhere between the two that changes depending on where the light hits. The saguaros run along both sides of the interstate in broken columns, some of them 30, 40 feet tall. Old enough that they were standing there before I was born, before my father was born, before anyone in my family had ever heard of Arizona. They don't look like they're growing. They look like they've always been there, and always will be, indifferent to everything that passes underneath them. I'd driven this stretch of I-10 more times than I could count. Supply runs in the early years, when I go to Tucson myself rather than pay freight on materials we needed by morning. Client meetings. A handful of projects in the late 90s when the Tucson residential market had opened up and we'd chased the work south. I knew every exit, every overpass, every place where the road curved slightly and the mountains came into view at a different angle than you expected. Cole sat in the passenger seat with the folder on his lap and his eyes on the desert. He didn't push me to talk. That was something he'd learned early, or maybe something he was born with. His mother had always said Cole came out of the womb already thinking, already sorting through whatever was in front of him before he decided what to do about it. I'd never known whether that was a compliment. We were past Casa Grande before he spoke. "Tell me about him," Cole said. I kept my eyes on the road. "I told you some of it in the parking lot." "You told me what he does," Cole said. "Tell me about him." I thought about how to answer that. There are people you meet in the course of building something who become part of the structure itself. Not just people who helped you along the way, but people without whom the thing wouldn't be what it is. Walter Briggs was one of those people. Explaining him felt like explaining the foundation of a building to someone who'd only ever seen the facade. "I met him in the spring of 1989, I said. "I was 30 years old. I had a construction license, a used cement mixer, 3 guys who trusted me enough to work for cash on Fridays, and a contract to build a house in Chandler for a school teacher named Helen Morrow. I checked the mirror out of habit. I'd underbid the job by about 12% because I wanted the work badly enough that I'd convinced myself I could make the numbers work. The way you do when you're 30 and you don't know yet what you don't know. Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh. I needed a structural certification to pull the permits, I said. Standard requirement. You get a licensed engineer to review your plans, certify the structural integrity, sign off. Most contractors had a guy they used regularly, someone who knew their work, trusted their methods. I didn't know anyone. I was new enough that nobody knew me yet. I shifted in my seat. I asked around. 3 engineers turned me down. One of them told me I was undercapitalized and should come back when I had a real company. Another one looked at my plans for about 4 minutes and said my beam calculations were off, which they were, and charged me $200 for the consultation. What did you do? I fixed the beam calculations, I said. Then I asked around some more, and someone, I can't even remember who now, mentioned Walter Briggs. Said he was difficult. Said he didn't certify work he didn't believe in, and he didn't care who was asking. Said he'd turned down 3 of the biggest contractors in the valley that year alone. I looked at the road ahead. That sounded to me like exactly the man I needed. The mountains to the south were clearer now, the Santa Catalinas rising out of the desert floor in a long blue ridge that looked close enough to touch and was probably 40 miles away. Arizona distances were like that. Things looked near because the air was clear and there was nothing between you and them. He came out to the site on a Wednesday morning, I said. July. 108 degrees by 10 o'clock. I had the foundation poured and the framing started. He walked the entire site without saying a word. Checked every connection, every anchor bolt, every load path from the roof to the foundation. Took him 2 hours. I walked with him and kept my mouth shut because I could tell that was what he needed from me. Cole turned slightly in his seat, watching me. When he was done, he went back to his truck and sat in the air conditioning for about 10 minutes. I stood outside in the heat and waited. Then he got out, put his plans on the hood of his truck, and asked me one question. I paused. He asked me what I thought a house was supposed to do for the people inside it. What did you say? I said I thought a house was supposed to make people feel like the ground under them was solid. Like whatever came at them from outside the structure itself would hold. I glanced at Cole. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he uncapped his pen and signed the certification on the hood of his truck. I looked back at the road. He told me one thing before he drove away. He said, "Build it right, and it'll outlast everything they throw at it." The interstate hummed beneath us. A semi passed in the left lane, pushing a wall of air that rocked the car slightly, and then was gone. He kept certifying our work, I said. Every project through 2003, 14 years. He never charged me more than his standard rate. Never asked for anything beyond what the work required. But every time he walked the site himself. Never sent an assistant. Never signed off on paperwork without seeing the actual structure. I moved into the right lane as a cluster of cars came up fast behind us. The last project he certified for us was a school in Mesa. He walked that site in August, which meant 111 degrees, and he was 63 years old. He didn't complain. He checked every weld on the steel frame with his own hands. And then he retired, Cole said. And then he retired, I said. Moved to Tucson. Stopped taking calls. I tried to reach him twice in the first year. Once to thank him for something. Once because I had a question about a project we were bidding. He didn't call back either time. I stopped trying. I watched the exit signs pass. I heard from someone in the industry that he was done. that he'd decided the work was finished and he didn't see a reason to keep being available. Cole was quiet for a moment. "But the certification didn't expire," he said. "The certification doesn't expire," I said. "It's tied to my license, which is current, and it's tied to his signature, which is on a document that still exists." I looked at the road. "What I don't know is whether there's a provision for revocation, whether he can pull it if he decides to, whether Diana's attorney found something in the language that I haven't." "That's what you need to know." "That's part of what I need to know," I said. "The other part is whether Walter Briggs is still the man who signed that certification. Whether 35 years is long enough to change what a person believes about the work." Cole thought about that. "You think he's been watching?" he asked. I thought about the way Walter had moved through that job site in 1989, the way nothing escaped him, the systematic attention he'd given to every connection point, every place where one structure met another and had to bear the weight of both. "I think men like Walter Briggs don't stop watching," I said. "They just stop being visible." The exit for Tucson came up on the right. I signaled and moved toward it, and the city began to come into view below us, spread across the desert floor between the mountain ranges. A different kind of place than Phoenix. Smaller, slower. The kind of city that suited a man who had decided he was done being found. "What if he won't see us?" Cole said. "Then we drive back and we fight with what we have," I said. "But I've been in this business for 35 years, Cole, and I've learned one thing about men who build their careers on not certifying work they don't believe in." I took the exit. "They're still paying attention," I said, "even when they pretend they're not." The street was called Mesquite Lane, which was either someone's idea of poetry or just the name of the tree that grew in a crooked line along the curb, their roots lifting the sidewalk in long, slow heaves, the way roots do when they've been at it long enough, and nobody's told them to stop. The houses on Mesquite Lane were small and well kept, the kind of neighborhood where people had lived for 30 years and intended to keep living. Gravel yards instead of grass, the desert practicality of people who understood water. Terracotta pots on front porches, with late-season flowers that had no business still blooming in November, but were doing it anyway. A dog somewhere behind a block wall, not barking, just moving, the sound of paws on concrete. Walter's house was third from the end. I knew it was his before I checked the number because there was a level mounted beside the front door, a vintage torpedo level in a brass case, the kind that hadn't been manufactured since the 70s. Not decorative, functional. The bubble was centered. I pulled to the curb and turned off the engine. No vehicle in the driveway. The single-car garage door was closed with the kind of deliberateness that suggested it was always closed. The front window had the blinds angled down, admitting light but not view. The choice of a man who had decided he was done being observed. Cole looked at the house, then at me. "No car," he said. "He's home," I said. I got out. The gravel path to the front door was raked clean, the lines still visible from the last time it had been done, recently enough that the November wind hadn't disturbed them. The torpedo level watched me approach. I reached the front door, a solid wood door painted the color of old adobe, and knocked twice. Nothing. Not the silence of an empty house, which has a particular quality, a flatness that you learn to recognize after enough years of walking through buildings. This was the silence of a house with someone in it who had decided whether or not to answer. Cole had come up behind me. He didn't say anything. I knocked again. 3 times, deliberate the way you knock when you're not asking permission. A long pause. Long enough that Cole shifted his weight on the gravel behind me. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened. Walter Briggs had lost weight since the last time I'd seen him, which had been at the Mesa School Project in August of 2003. The heaviness he'd carried through most of his working years was gone, replaced by the lean economy of a man in his mid-70s who had simplified everything down to what was necessary. His hair was fully white, now cut short and practical. He was wearing work pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his hands, when he gripped the edge of the door, still showed the thickness across the knuckles that came from decades of handling tools and materials. His eyes were the same, gray-sharp, the kind of eyes that categorized what they looked at before they decided what to do with the information. They moved from my face to Cole's face and back to mine, and something in them settled, the way the bubble settles in a level when you've found the horizontal. He looked at me for a long moment. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said. He stepped back from the door. The inside of the house was what I'd expected, and more ordered than I could have managed. Books on every wall, not decorative books arranged by color or size, but working books. Engineering texts and building codes, and half a dozen volumes on soil mechanics that I recognized from my own bookshelves 30 years ago. Drawing tubes in a stand beside the door. A work table under the front window with a project spread across it, something in the early stages, pencil on drafting paper. Walter was still working. Not for clients, for himself. Because the thinking didn't stop just because the certifying had. He went to the kitchen without asking if we wanted anything, which told me he'd already decided he was going to make coffee, which told me he'd already decided this was going to be a conversation worth having. Cole and I sat at the kitchen table. It was a plain table wood, the kind that had been in the same spot for 20 years and would be there for 20 more. There were no placemats, no centerpiece. A single coffee mug from the University of Arizona already sitting near the sink, rinsed and waiting. Walter set the percolator on the stove. Old machine, the kind that made coffee the way it was supposed to be made, with heat and time instead of pressure and convenience. He stood with his back to us while it worked, looking out the window above the sink at the gravel yard and the mesquite tree at the property line. "Your wife called me," he said, not turning around, not making a question of it. Cole went still beside me. "When?" I asked. "May." Walter watched the yard. "Spring. Before the divorce filing, before any of the board business. She was careful about the sequencing, I'll give her that. She wanted to know about the transferability of the certification before she moved any other piece." He turned from the window and looked at me directly. "She wanted to know if my signature could be transferred to another party, specifically to a Marcus Webb, whom she described as the incoming chief operating officer of Holt Construction." The percolator made its sound. Walter turned back to it, poured 2 mugs without asking how we took it, set them on the table, and remained standing. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. I didn't return her call. Cole let out a breath that he'd been holding. "She called twice more," Walter said. "Different numbers. A law office the second time, which told me she'd moved from exploratory to operational. I didn't return those either." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, moving with the careful economy of a man who had made peace with the fact that his body required more attention than it used to. "I want you to understand something, Raymond. I didn't ignore those calls because I knew what was happening. I ignored them because I'd learned over 40 years of this work that when someone asks about transferring a certification before they've asked the person named on it, the answer they're looking for is not one I'm willing to give." He reached across the table and opened the drawer built into the table's side. An old piece of furniture, the kind made when drawers were still made to last. He reached in and drew out a manila envelope. The paper yellowed at the edges with age, the kind of yellowing that happens over decades in dry desert air. He set it on the table between us. I recognized it. Not the envelope specifically, but what was inside it. The weight of it, the dimensions, a single page folded once. I hadn't seen the original since 1989, but some things you recognize across 35 years. The way you recognize the face of someone who was important to you before you understood what important meant. 6 months ago, Walter said, his gray eyes level on mine. Your wife called me about this document. I didn't answer. He set one hand flat on the envelope. I was waiting to see something first. He paused. I was waiting to see what kind of man you'd become. Walter opened the envelope the way he did everything else. Without ceremony, without hesitation. With the particular economy of motion that belongs to men who have spent their lives doing precise work and have stopped being interested in anything that isn't. He unfolded the document and laid it flat on the table between us. One page, handwritten in black ink on engineering letterhead that I recognized even after 35 years. The Briggs Structural Engineering header at the top, with the Arizona state license number beneath it. The ink slightly faded now, but still legible, still exact. The paragraphs were written in Walter's hand, which was the same in 1989 as it appeared to be now. Small and measured, every letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that written language was a load-bearing structure and treated it accordingly. I hadn't read the original document in years. The copy I kept in the company files I'd looked at occasionally, usually when we were bidding a federal contract and the project manager needed to verify our certification chain. But the original I hadn't held since the day Walter had handed it to me in the parking lot of the Chandler job site, folded into a plain envelope, no fanfare. I read it now. The language was straightforward in the way that genuinely careful legal writing is straightforward. Not simplified, not evasive, but precise. It said what it meant and meant what it said. Walter Briggs, duly licensed, structural engineer, State of Arizona, license number 47-219. Hereby certifies the professional competence and structural methodology of Raymond Allen Holt, sole proprietor, Holt Construction, for the purposes of residential and commercial construction licensing in the state of Arizona and associated federal jurisdictions. Then the clause that I'd read and noted in 1989 and not thought about since, because in 1989 it had seemed like standard protective language, and I hadn't yet understood how important standard protective language becomes when someone decides to test it. This certification is issued to Raymond Allen Holt as an individual professional and is non-transferable to any successor entity partner or third party without the express written consent of the certifying engineer. Furthermore, this certification remains contingent upon the certificant maintaining sole operational authority over any enterprise operating under its provisions. Transfer or relinquishment of said authority, whether voluntary or compelled, shall constitute grounds for immediate review and potential suspension of certification at the discretion of the certifying engineer. I read it twice. Cole leaned over and read it once. Walter watched us read it. Sole operational authority, I said. That's the phrase, Walter said. I put it in every certification I issued after 1984. I'd seen what happened when a certification got separated from the person it was issued to. A contractor in Flagstaff, good man, built solid work. His partner bought him out, kept using the certification, started cutting corners, because the man whose name was on it wasn't in the room anymore. Walter's hands rested flat on the table. 2 years later, a roof failed on a commercial building during a monsoon. Nobody was hurt, but it was close. The contractor's name was on the certification. The contractor hadn't touched the project. He looked at me. I added the clause the following year. Diana's attorney would have read this, Cole said. Diana's attorney would have read the copy in your company files, Walter said. Attorneys read copies. They look for what the language says on its face. What they don't always look for is what the language was written to prevent. He tapped the paragraph with one finger. The question your wife was asking when she called me in May was whether my signature could be transferred to Marcus Webb. The answer is in the first sentence of that clause. It cannot. Not without my express written consent. Which you didn't give, I said. Which I will not give, Walter said. The distinction was deliberate, not past tense, present and continuing. He refolded the document and slid it back into the envelope with the same careful movements he'd used to take it out. "There's something else in the agreement," he said. "Further down. A provision I've never had to invoke in 40 years of certifying work." He set the envelope aside. "I'll come to it. But first I want to understand what you have." He looked at Cole. Cole straightened in his chair the way he did when he was shifting from listening to presenting. The posture change of an engineer about to walk you through a set of calculations. 8 months of financial records, Cole said. Wire transfers, invoice approvals, payment authorizations, all routed through an LLC called Holt Southwest, registered in Scottsdale 8 months ago. The LLC was set up by Marcus Webb without disclosure to the board or to my father. He set the drive on the table. 3,800 files. I can show you the 12 clearest transactions, or I can show you all of it. "Show me the 12, Walter said. "I'll tell you if I need more." Cole opened his laptop, plugged in the drive, and pulled up the first file. Walter put on a pair of reading glasses that he took from his shirt pocket. They were plain drugstore glasses, the kind a man buys because he needs to see clearly and has stopped caring whether the frames are interesting. He leaned forward and read the first invoice on Cole's screen. He read it the same way he'd walked construction sites, systematically starting at the top left and moving right and down. Not skimming, not looking for the headline, reading every line, because he'd learned over decades of work that the thing that matters is almost never in the headline. He moved to the second invoice, then the third. He asked Cole to scroll slowly. Cole scrolled slowly. By the sixth invoice, Walter's expression had not changed in any way that I could have described to someone. But something had shifted behind his eyes. The same quality I'd noticed in the parking lot of the Chandler job site 35 years ago when he'd finished his inspection and gone to sit in his truck. The categorizing was done. The decision was being made. He reached the 12th invoice and sat back. "Pull up the email folder," he said. Cole looked at me. "There are emails," I said to Walter. "Internal communications." Cole flagged several that he thought were relevant. "Pull them up," Walter said. Cole navigated to the folder he'd labeled Priority. The 12 emails he'd identified in the 6 weeks he'd spent building the case before bringing it to me. He opened the folder and turned the laptop so Walter could see the screen. Walter leaned forward again. The emails were threaded Marcus to Diana and back. The subject lines, businesslike. The language careful, in the way that language is careful. When the person writing it knows it shouldn't exist, but believes it won't be found. Cole had sorted them by date. Walter started at the top and worked down. He stopped at the 4th email. He read it twice. Then he straightened up, took off his reading glasses, folded them with a single practiced motion, and set them on the table beside the laptop. He looked at me. "They were going to forge my name," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Not the quiet of a room where nothing is happening, but the kind that follows a statement that has changed the nature of everything that came before it. The percolator had finished its work. Outside, the mesquite tree moved slightly in a wind that hadn't reached the house yet. Cole's laptop screen cast a pale light across the table. Walter sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the email on the screen for a long moment after he'd said it. Then he stood up, went to the counter, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't pour one for us. He stood at the counter with his back to the room and drank half of it before he turned around. "Read me the date on that email," he said. Cole checked the screen. "September 14th, 2 months ago." Walter set the mug down. "Before the board vote. Before the divorce filing." He looked at me. "Your wife had already decided by September that my cooperation wasn't forthcoming. So Marcus moved to the contingency." "The forgery," I said. "The forgery," Walter said, "which is a federal offense when it involves a state-issued professional license. not a civil matter. Not something that gets settled in a Maricopa County courtroom with a property division agreement. His voice was the same as it had been all morning, measured and flat. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Not anger exactly, closer to the particular coldness of a man who has spent 40 years building a reputation for integrity and has just been told that someone intended to put his name on a lie. Pull up the rest of the thread. Cole scrolled down. The email thread ran to 7 messages. Marcus to Diana. Diana to Marcus. The back and forth of 2 people who believed they were operating in a space where consequences didn't reach. The language was careful, but not careful enough. The kind of carefulness that comes from people who are confident rather than cautious. They referenced the certification obliquely in the earlier messages, called it the licensing matter, the Briggs situation, the credential question. By the 5th message, Marcus had stopped being oblique. He'd written, "If the old man won't play, we handle it ourselves. I have someone who can replicate signatures. Done it before on smaller stuff. Nobody checks these documents once they're filed." Cole read it aloud from the screen, in the same level voice he used for everything, the voice of someone who had learned early that the information was what mattered, not the performance of reacting to it. Nobody checks these documents once they're filed. I thought about the 40 years of work that Walter Briggs had built on the assumption that his name meant something. The sites he'd walked in summer heat. The contractors he'd turned down because the work wasn't right. The lawyers he'd talked to when he wasn't sure about the language in an agreement because he'd always understood that his signature was worth exactly what he was worth and not 1 ounce more. Marcus Webb had looked at 40 years of that and decided nobody would check. Walter set down his coffee mug. How many projects does Holt Construction currently have under federal or state contract? He asked. 14, Cole said. 8 federal, 6 state. Combined contract value of $62 million. All of them operating under my certification. All of them. Walter nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd confirmed something he'd already calculated. He went to the work table under the front window, moved the drafting project aside with careful hands, and set his coffee mug in the cleared space. Then he stood there, looking out at the street for a moment, at the mesquite tree and the raked gravel, and the quiet of a neighborhood that didn't know anything about Holt Construction Group or LLC filings, or a man named Marcus Webb who had decided that nobody checks. The provision I mentioned, Walter said without turning from the window. The one further down in the agreement that I've never had to invoke. I remember, I said. It allows for immediate suspension of certification upon credible evidence of fraudulent activity involving any enterprise operating under its provisions. He turned from the window. I've had it in every certification agreement since 1986. In 40 years, I've never used it. He looked at me steadily. I'm going to use it now, but not as a suspension, as a pressure point. Cole looked at me, then back at Walter. Meaning what? Cole asked. Meaning I'm going to Phoenix with you, Walter said. And I'm going to sit in that courtroom tomorrow morning. And when the time comes, I'm going to explain to a judge exactly what this certification means, exactly what the clause says, and exactly what I intend to do with it if the court rules in a way that transfers operational authority away from your father. He picked up his coffee mug and finished what was left in it. A certification suspension wouldn't just affect the 14 active contracts. It would affect Holt Construction's ability to bid any new work in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. It would trigger a review clause in most of your existing contracts. At $62 million of active work, a suspension would effectively make the company worthless to anyone who didn't have my cooperation. The room was quiet again. Cole closed the laptop slowly. I'd spent 11 days in a hotel room, reading through Diana's settlement agreement, looking for the seam, the place where the poor had gone wrong. I hadn't found it, because I'd been looking in the wrong document. "Call your attorney," Walter said. "Tell him we're coming." Cole pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. I stayed at the table with Walter. He refilled his coffee mug and remained standing the way he'd stood on job sites in the old days. Comfortable on his feet. Alert in the way that men are alert when they've been paying attention for a long time and have finally found something worth acting on. "You've been watching," I said. "I told you," he said. "Men like me don't stop watching." From the hallway, I could hear Cole on the phone with Arthur Dean. The low, measured voice of my son laying out facts in the order they needed to be laid out. The same way he walked a job site, systematic and without drama. When Cole came back to the kitchen doorway, his expression had shifted slightly. Not surprised. Cole rarely looked surprised. But focused, in a way that told me Arthur had said something that mattered. "Arthur wants us at his office tonight," Cole said. "He says there's something in the LLC filing he found this morning that he needs us to see in person." He paused. "He said to tell you it's not in the provision you've been looking at." Walter looked at me. I looked at Cole. "What does that mean?" I asked. Cole leaned against the doorframe. "He said it's in the clause you wrote yourself," Cole said. 18 months ago, Walter went to the coat rack beside the front door and took down a canvas work jacket, the kind with a corduroy collar worn smooth at the edges. Dark green, faded to something closer to gray by years of desert sun. He put it on with the same deliberateness he did everything else. One arm and then the other. Adjusted the collar. Checked the pockets, the way a man checks pockets when he's preparing to leave the house for something that matters. He picked up the cane from beside the coat rack. I hadn't noticed it when he'd answered the door. It was plain wood, no ornament. The kind of cane a man uses when he's decided that needing one is a fact and not a statement. "I'll drive myself," he said. "I know the way to Phoenix." "We can take you," Cole said. "I know you can." Walter set the cane against the wall and went back to the kitchen. "But I'll want my own vehicle there, in case the timing shifts and you need me somewhere I haven't planned for." He rinsed his coffee mug at the sink, set it in the drying rack, and turned off the kitchen light. "I'll leave at 5 tomorrow morning. I know a route that avoids the construction on the I-10 north of Tucson. I'll be at your attorney's office by 7. Cole looked at me. I nodded once. Walter moved through the house with the efficiency of a man who had been living alone for long enough that his routines were optimized down to the motion. He checked the lock on the back door. He turned off the light over the work table. He picked up a small notebook from beside the drafting materials and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he stopped. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "I need to make a call before we go any further." He went into the back of the house, and we heard the low sound of his voice. Not the words, just the cadence of someone speaking with precision about something technical. It went on for about 8 minutes. When he came back to the kitchen doorway, his expression was the same as it had been all morning. But there was something settled in it, the kind of settled that comes after a decision has been made and acted on. "I've contacted the Arizona Registrar of Contractors," he said. "I've informed them that I'm initiating a review of my certification of Holt Construction Group due to credible evidence of unauthorized transfer of operational authority. They'll log it as of today. It doesn't trigger suspension yet, but it creates a formal record of the review process." He looked at me. "When I appear in court tomorrow, there will be a state record showing that I've already begun the review. It's not just testimony. It's a documented regulatory action." I looked at him. "You've been planning this," I said. "I've been considering it," Walter said. "Since your daughter called me last month." The room went still. Cole turned from the window. "Saskia," I said. "She called the week your wife filed the divorce papers," Walter said. "She found my number through the Arizona Engineering Licensing Board. I don't know how she knew to look there." He paused. "She told me what was happening. She asked if I'd be willing to review the certification agreement and consider my options." He set the notebook on the counter. She was 26 years old, and she was calling a man she'd never met to ask him to help her father. I thought that was worth a conversation. I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 3 weeks. The last time had been a phone call that ended badly. The kind of call that ends badly because both people are trying to protect the other from the size of what's happening, and neither one is doing it well. She was in Seattle, working at an architecture firm 3 years out of school, and I'd told her to stay out of it. I'd told her it was being handled. I'd told her I didn't want her involved. She'd called Walter Briggs anyway. Walter picked up his cane from where he'd leaned it and moved toward the front door. "She didn't tell you," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said. "She said she wouldn't. She said she needed to know first whether I'd actually come, before she gave you something to count on." He opened the front door, and the November air moved through the house dry and cool, carrying the smell of the desert and someone's wood smoke 2 streets over. I respect that kind of thinking. She understood that hope without a foundation is just weight. We went outside. The afternoon had moved while we'd been inside. The sun, tracking west, the way it did in November, lower and more direct than summer, throwing long shadows across the raked gravel and the bent mesquite at the property line. Walter locked the front door with a key he kept on a plain ring with 2 others. He tested the knob once, then turned toward the street. Cole was standing at the edge of the gravel path looking at the 2 of us. He had his jacket zipped against the cool air, his hands in his pockets, and there was something in his expression that I hadn't seen there in the 11 days since this had started. Not relief, closer to recognition. The look of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has just realized it's been distributed without his knowing. Walter said, 7 o'clock tomorrow. Tell your attorney. He walked to the garage and disappeared inside. A moment later, a truck engine turned over, the sound of something kept in good working order. And then the garage door rolled up and Walter's truck backed carefully down the driveway. A dark blue Ford that looked like it had been bought for function and maintained for years, and not replaced because there was no reason to replace something that worked. He raised one hand through the driver's window as he pulled into the street. Then he was gone around the corner at the end of Mesquite Lane. Cole and I stood in the quiet of the afternoon. "She called him," Cole said. "Apparently," I said. Cole thought about that. The way he thought about things working through the sequence, the timing, the logic of what his sister had done, and when she'd done it, and what it had required of her to do it. "She called a stranger," Cole said, "and asked him to come to Phoenix." "Yes." And he came. "He's coming," I said. "Tomorrow." Cole looked at the corner where Walter's truck had turned and disappeared. Then he looked at me with the expression he'd worn since we were children, when he was trying to understand something that didn't fit neatly into the categories he'd built for the world. "Dad," he said, "you knew this was coming, didn't you? Some of it. Not all of it, but some of it." The afternoon light lay flat and long across Mesquite Lane. Somewhere down the block, the dog that had been moving behind the wall earlier was still moving, patient and unhurried, making its slow circuit of whatever space it had been given. I looked at my son. I thought about a document I'd written 18 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in my office, before the closed-door meetings, before the changed passwords, before the late phone calls that stopped when I walked into a room, when it had still been a suspicion and not a certainty, when I'd still been hoping I was wrong. I hadn't answered yet when Cole said, "We should get on the road. Arthur's waiting." He turned and walked to the car. I stood on Mesquite Lane for one more moment in the late afternoon light of a November day in Tucson. And then I followed my son. Arthur Dean's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Central Avenue that had been there since before either of us was practicing anything. A glass and concrete structure from the late 60s that the city had never gotten around to replacing because it was still structurally sound, and nobody in Phoenix tore down things that were still structurally sound. The elevator opened onto a hallway that smelled like copy paper and carpet cleaner, and Arthur's suite was at the end of it. the lights still on at 7:45 in the evening, because Arthur Dean had never, in the 12 years I'd known him, been the kind of man who left before the work was finished. He was at his desk when Cole and I came in. His jacket over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. 3 separate document stacks arranged in front of him with the precision of a man who thought spatially and needed his thinking to be visible. He stood when we entered, shook my hand, shook Cole's, and looked at both of us with the expression of someone who has been sitting with difficult information and is deciding the best order to deliver it. "Walter Briggs," he said. "Tell me he's actually coming." 7 o'clock, Cole said. "He'll be here." Arthur absorbed this with a single nod, the way he absorbed most information without editorial. He'd been practicing construction and real estate law in Phoenix for 26 years, and somewhere in that time, he'd shed whatever instinct lawyers sometimes carry to perform their reactions. He just received things and worked with them. "Sit down," he said. We sat. Walter had taken the chair by the window, which faced Central Avenue, 14 floors below the city, moving through its evening in the way cities do, indifferent to the particular crises of particular people. Arthur picked up the top document from the left stack and set it in front of me. "This is the LLC filing Marcus Webb submitted to the Arizona Corporation Commission in March," he said. "I've had it since this morning. Your wife's attorney sent it as part of the standard discovery exchange, which tells me either they don't know what's in it or they decided it didn't matter." He set his finger on the signature line at the bottom of page 3. "That's your signature." I looked at it. Raymond Allen Holt. My name, in handwriting that looked like mine, the way a photograph of a stranger can look like someone you know if you're not paying close enough attention. The angle of the letters, the pressure, the slight rightward lean that my signature had always carried. Someone had studied it carefully. "I didn't sign this," I said. "I know," Arthur said. "I had a document examiner look at a digital copy this afternoon. Preliminary finding is that it's a traced forgery, not a freehand imitation. Whoever did it used a light table or a digital overlay. The line quality is too consistent for freehand." He took the document back. "A full forensic analysis will take a week, but the examiner is confident enough that I'll put her on the stand if it comes to that." Cole was leaning forward with his elbows on the conference table, looking at the document. "Marcus did it himself?" Cole asked. "Or had it done," Arthur said. "The email thread you sent me this afternoon references someone Marcus refers to as a document guy. Same person mentioned in connection with the certification forgery plan." He moved to the second document stack. "The forgery gives us 2 things. 1, it invalidates the LLC filing on its face, which means the transfer of operational authority that Diana's attorney will argue was consensual was not consensual and was not legal. 2, it's a criminal act, which changes the nature of this proceeding considerably." Walter had been sitting quietly by the window through all of this, his cane across his knees, his eyes moving between Arthur and the documents, with the same systematic attention he gave to structural drawings. He hadn't spoken since we'd arrived. "What's your strategy?" I asked Arthur. Arthur sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been working on for a while. "Vivian Cross is good," he said. "She's prepared. She'll come in tomorrow with the LLC filing as her centerpiece, argue that you voluntarily transferred operational authority to Holt Southwest, and use that as the foundation for everything else. The infidelity allegations, the financial mismanagement claims, the request for full asset transfer." He brought his gaze back down. "She's going to lay it all out in the first 90 minutes, every piece of it." "And you're going to let her," I said. "I'm going to let her," Arthur said, "because the more completely she builds her case on that LLC filing, the more completely it comes apart when we introduce the forensic analysis." He leaned forward. "You don't win a case like this by objecting. You win it by letting the other side construct a structure on a foundation you know is going to fail. and then you show the court the foundation. He picked up the third document stack. This one was thinner than the others, a single folder with a tab on the side that I could read from across the table. It said, Holt Construction, Internal, Section 9. He opened it and turned it to face me. "When did you write this?" he asked. The document inside was a 2-page amendment to Holt Construction's internal operating agreement. I recognized it immediately, not because I'd looked at it recently, but because I'd written it myself, at my desk in the office on Scottsdale Road, on a Tuesday afternoon 18 months ago, on a day when I'd come back from a supplier meeting to find Diana in my office, on my computer. And she'd told me she was looking for a contact number she hadn't been able to find anywhere else. I'd written the amendment that evening. Section 9, subsection B. Transfer of operational authority through fraudulent means, including, but not limited to, forgery of authorization documents, unauthorized LLC formation in the company name, or misrepresentation to regulatory bodies, shall constitute automatic grounds for reversion of all operational assets, contracts, and licensing agreements to the founding principal. Said reversion shall take effect upon judicial finding of fraud and shall not require separate legal action. Arthur watched me read it. "You buried it in a routine amendment," he said. "Standard operating agreement update. Your wife's signature is on the acknowledgement page because all officers signed that quarter's amendments as a block." He closed the folder. Vivian Cross reviewed the settlement agreement. She reviewed the LLC filing. She reviewed the financial disclosures. He paused. She didn't review the internal operating agreement amendments from 18 months ago. The room was quiet for a moment. Cole was looking at me. I didn't look at him. I looked at Arthur. "How confident are you?" I asked. "In the forgery analysis, very," Arthur said. "In 9B completely. It's your company's internal document, properly executed, properly witnessed, filed with the Corporation Commission in the normal course." He closed his folder and set it on top of the others. "Raymond Vivian Cross is going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning believing she's taking everything you built. She's going to spend 90 minutes constructing an argument on top of a forged document." He looked at me steadily. "We're not just defending. We're closing a trap." Walter spoke from the window for the first time since we'd arrived. "What time do you need me there?" he said. The Maricopa County Superior Court on West Jefferson Street was a building I'd driven past 1,000 times without going inside, the way you drive past certain buildings your whole life, until the day you don't have a choice. 8 stories of concrete and glass, the Arizona state seal above the entrance, the flag moving in a wind that came off the desert to the west and smelled of nothing in particular. It was the kind of building designed to communicate permanence without warmth, which I supposed was appropriate for a place where things ended. I got there at 8:50. Arthur was already inside in the hallway outside courtroom 4 on the 3rd floor, his briefcase beside him, his jacket buttoned, a coffee cup in his hand that he'd nearly finished. He looked like a man who had slept adequately and thought clearly and was prepared, which was what I needed him to look like. Walter was there too. He'd arrived at 7 as promised, driven himself up from Tucson on the route he'd said avoided the construction, and met Arthur at the office for 2 hours to go through his testimony. Now he stood near the window at the end of the hallway, his cane in his right hand, looking out at the city below, with the stillness of someone who had been in many rooms where important things happened, and had learned not to spend energy on the waiting. Cole was beside me. He'd driven separately, met me in the parking structure, and said almost nothing on the walk in. He was wearing a jacket and tie, the first time I'd seen him in a tie since his college graduation. And it looked uncomfortable on him, the way dress clothes always looked uncomfortable on men who worked with their hands for a living. He wore it anyway, because he understood what the room required. I looked through the narrow window set into the courtroom door. Diana was already at the plaintiff's table on the left side of the room. She was wearing a charcoal suit I recognized from a charity event 2 years ago. The one she'd bought specifically because someone had told her she looked authoritative in it, which she did. Her posture was perfect. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, not tense, not relaxed, simply positioned the way she positioned everything. Marcus stood behind the railing in the gallery 1 row back. He was wearing a suit I didn't recognize. Navy blue, well-fitted. The kind of suit you buy when you want people to believe you've always worn suits. He was checking his phone with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with his hands. Vivian Cross was at the plaintiff's table beside Diana, arranging her documents with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and had reduced the preparation to muscle memory. She was a small woman with dark hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the quality of compressed energy that belongs to people who are very good at something and know it, and have stopped needing anyone else to know it. Arthur held the door for me. We went in. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, which was something I'd been told about courtrooms but hadn't understood until I was inside one. Not the sweeping rooms of television, but a working space, functional and plain, with wooden benches in the gallery and 2 counsel tables, and a raised bench at the front where the judge would sit, and a witness stand to the right of that, and an American flag and an Arizona state flag on either side of the bench, that had seen enough air conditioning to have lost whatever crispness they'd started with. We settled at the defense table on the right. Cole sat in the gallery behind us, directly behind my chair. I didn't look at Diana. I'd decided that in the parking structure, going over the things I needed to decide before I walked into the room. There was nothing I needed to read in her face. I knew her face. I'd been reading it for 30 years. At 9:02, the bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Carol Stanton came in from the door behind the bench. She was 58, which I knew because Arthur had told me, and she looked like someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time, and had made peace with the fact that it was going to keep being difficult. She had short gray hair, and the kind of reading glasses that suggested she'd stopped caring whether they were fashionable sometime in the early part of the previous decade. She sat down, arranged the files in front of her with 2 precise adjustments, and looked at the room over the top of her glasses. "We're here in the matter of Holt versus Holt," she said. "Ms. Cross, you may proceed." Vivian Cross stood. She was good. Arthur had told me she was good, and I'd taken that seriously, because Arthur didn't say things for effect. She opened without notes, which was either genuine command of the material or a performance of genuine command. And in this context, the distinction didn't matter, because the effect was the same. She addressed Judge Stanton directly, not the room, not the gallery, the judge, which was the right instinct in a bench trial where there was no jury to play to. "Your Honor," she said, "my client Diana Holt has been a central architect of Holt Construction Group's growth over the past 3 decades. During that time, Mr. Holt progressively excluded her from operational decisions while simultaneously making unilateral choices that exposed the company to significant financial risk." She was rewriting 35 years in the present tense. I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was how clean it would sound, how reasonable, how much like a story someone would believe if they only had her version. She moved to the LLC filing. She placed a copy on Judge Stanton's bench and kept one at her table. And she walked through it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this section specifically, the way you rehearse a section when you know it's the load-bearing wall of your entire argument. "On March 3rd of this year," Vivian said, "Mr. Holt signed this document, voluntarily transferring operational authority over Holt Construction's primary projects to Holt Southwest LLC, a successor entity under the management of Marcus Webb, who serves as Chief Operating Officer. This transfer was executed by Mr. Holt himself, as evidenced by his signature on page 3. I felt Arthur's hand touch my arm once, briefly, the way he'd told me he would when I needed to stay still. I stayed still. I picked up the legal pad in front of me and wrote, Why aren't you fighting? I slid the pad toward Arthur. He read it, picked up his pen, and wrote below my question without looking at me. Not yet. I looked at the front of the room. Vivian was in full motion now, building the structure the way a good contractor builds. From the foundation up, each element placed before the next. I watched Marcus in my peripheral vision. He was watching Vivian with the focused attention of someone following a performance he'd paid for. But his right hand resting on the gallery railing was moving. A small, repetitive motion, the index finger tapping twice, stopping, tapping twice again. Not the gesture of a man watching something go according to plan. The gesture of a man managing something that hasn't gone wrong yet, but that he knows is fragile. Vivian reached the end of her opening. She returned to the plaintiff's table, picked up the LLC filing, and walked it to Judge Stanton's bench with the deliberate pace of someone placing a cornerstone. Your Honor, she said, this document represents Mr. Holt's own voluntary action. Everything that follows flows from it. She set it down. She turned and looked at me across the center aisle, with the expression of someone who has just delivered the first and most important element of an argument they believe is unassailable. I looked back at her. Behind the railing, Marcus's finger had stopped tapping. There is a particular quality to silence in a courtroom after an attorney sits down. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of assessment. The room recalibrating around what has just been said. Each person doing their own private arithmetic about what it means and what comes next. Vivian Cross sat down with the composed unhurriedness of someone who knew her opening had landed. She didn't look at Diana. She didn't look at me. She organized the documents in front of her with small adjustments, the way a craftsman straightens tools after using them, and waited for Judge Stanton to invite the next piece. Judge Stanton made a note and looked up. Miss Cross, she said, you indicated you have additional evidence. I do, Your Honor. Vivian rose. I'd like to introduce Exhibit 2, a series of photographs taken by a licensed security firm documenting Mr. Holt's activities over a period of 3 weeks in August of this year. She placed a folder on Judge Stanton's bench and returned to her table for her own copy. The photographs were 8 by 10 printed on good stock, clear enough that the details were readable from where I was sitting. They showed me at a construction site in North Scottsdale that I recognized, talking to a man I didn't. The man was white, mid-40s, hard hat work boots, the universal costume of someone who wanted to look like they belonged on a job site. In one photograph, we were shaking hands. In another, he was showing me something on a clipboard. In a third, I was signing what appeared to be a document. I had never met this man. I had never been shown a clipboard by this man. I had never signed anything for this man. But the photographs were real enough that I spent the first 30 seconds looking at them, trying to remember whether I'd somehow forgotten, whether there was some meeting in August that I'd lost track of, some subcontractor introduction that had blurred into the general noise of a busy summer. I hadn't forgotten. The meetings hadn't happened. But the photographs showed them happening, with the flat certainty that photographs carry, regardless of what they're actually depicting. This was what money could do. Not just the money to hire attorneys, but the money to construct something from nothing and make it look like evidence. The individual in these photographs, Vivian said, is a subcontractor named Gary Loomis, who operated through Southwest Framing Solutions, LLC, one of the entities through which funds were diverted from Holt construction accounts. She set a document beside the photographs on Judge Stanton's bench. Mr. Holt personally authorized payments to Southwest Framing Solutions totaling $640,000 over a period of 4 months. Mr. Loomis's company performed no documented work on any Holt construction project during this period. It was clean. I had to acknowledge that. Whoever had constructed this Marcus, or someone Marcus had hired, had understood that evidence needs to tell a story, not just present facts. And they'd built a story that was internally consistent and visually supported and plausible enough that a judge who didn't know me would have no immediate reason to doubt it. I wrote on the legal pad. They hired someone to pose as a contractor. Arthur read it without looking at me and wrote beneath it, "We know." The security firm that took these photos filed their work order last month. We have it. I looked at him. He didn't look back. I turned my attention to Marcus. He was watching Vivian with the concentrated focus of someone following a performance they'd invested in. But Cole, sitting directly behind me in the gallery, had shifted position. I could feel it through the back of my chair. The slight forward movement of someone who has noticed something. I glanced back once and caught Cole's eyes for just a moment. He gave the smallest tilt of his head toward Marcus. I looked back at the front of the room and let my attention go sideways the way you learn to watch a job site, not looking directly at the thing you're monitoring, but keeping it in the edge of your vision, where you'll catch movement without announcing that you're watching. Marcus's phone was in his lap. He was reading something on the screen, the glow visible even in the lighted courtroom, and whatever he was reading had taken his attention away from Vivian's presentation. He read it twice, then locked the screen and put the phone in his jacket pocket. He looked up at Vivian. Then his gaze moved to Arthur, and something changed in it. A quality of assessment that hadn't been there before. He'd received information. I didn't know what kind. But a man who had just received reassuring information doesn't assess his opponent's attorney. He watches his own. Vivian wrapped her presentation with the efficiency of someone who had timed it and was hitting her mark. Your Honor, the evidence establishes a clear pattern. Mr. Holt used his position as founder and former operational head of Holt Construction Group to siphon funds through entities he controlled personally. Entities that were connected to subcontractors who performed no verifiable work. The LLC transfer was his attempt to formalize what had already become the operational reality, with Marcus Webb handling legitimate operations while Mr. Holt diverted resources. She picked up a single clean page and added it to the stack on Judge Stanton's bench. We are requesting that the court affirm the LLC transfer, award Mrs. Holt full operational control of Holt Construction Group, and refer the financial irregularities to the appropriate authorities for investigation of Mr. Holt. She returned to her table. She sat down. She folded her hands. The silence came back. The same silence as before, but weighted differently now. The room recalibrating again around everything she'd built. And I felt the structure of it, the way you feel a building's weight when you're standing inside it, knowing where the load is going and where it isn't. It was built on a forged signature, which meant it was built on nothing. But it didn't know that yet. Judge Stanton looked across the room at Arthur. "Mr. Dean," she said, "your response." Arthur stood. He picked up one sheet of paper from the table in front of him. Then he picked up a USB drive and held it in his other hand. No briefcase opened, no stack of folders produced. One piece of paper and a drive the size of a thumb, which was the entire visible portion of what he'd spent 3 months preparing. Vivian's eyes tracked to the USB drive and stayed there for half a second longer than they should have. Arthur walked to the center of the room and addressed Judge Stanton directly. "Your Honor," he said, "before we respond to Ms. Cross's allegations, I'd like to draw the court's attention to something. Not something filed in this proceeding, not something prepared for this hearing." He held up the single sheet of paper. Something signed 35 years ago, in a parking lot in Chandler, Arizona, on the hood of a truck, in the middle of July when it was 108 degrees, and a young man was building his first house. Behind the railing, I heard Cole settle back in his seat. Marcus had gone very still. Arthur set the sheet of paper on Judge Stanton's bench first. Not the USB drive, the paper. One page. The photocopy of Walter's certification agreement from 1989. The one that had lived in Holt Construction's files for 35 years without anyone outside the company having reason to examine it carefully. Judge Stanton picked it up and read it, with the methodical attention she gave everything, starting at the top and working down. not skimming. "Your Honor," Arthur said, standing at the side of the bench rather than behind the podium. A positioning choice I recognized as deliberate, more conversational, less adversarial. The posture of a man explaining something rather than arguing it. "What you're holding is the professional certification agreement that has been the legal foundation of Holt Construction Group's ability to operate since 1989. Every federal contract, every state contract, every project requiring licensed structural certification across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico has operated under the authority of this document." Vivian had her pen ready, but wasn't writing yet. She was reading the copy on her own table, and I could see from the way her eyes moved that she was doing what attorneys do when they encounter something they haven't seen before, looking for the objection before she'd finished understanding what she was objecting to. "The certification was issued to Raymond Allen Holt as an individual," Arthur continued, "not to Holt Construction Group as an entity, not to any successor or assignee. To Mr. Holt personally, contingent upon his maintaining sole operational authority over any enterprise operating under its provisions." He paused a precise moment. Ms. Cross's entire argument rests on the premise that Mr. Holt voluntarily transferred operational authority. If that transfer is found to be involuntary or fraudulent, the certification is automatically subject to review by the issuing engineer. Vivian stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. This is a divorce proceeding, not a licensing dispute." "Miss Cross," Judge Stanton said, her eyes still on the document, "if the primary asset being contested cannot legally be transferred without triggering a certification review that is directly relevant to asset valuation." "Sit down." Vivian sat. Arthur moved to the laptop that Cole had set up on the defense table before the session began. He plugged in the USB drive and opened the presentation he'd prepared the night before. 3 hours of work compressed into 7 slides, each one a piece of the structure he was building. The first slide was the email, Marcus to Diana, September 14th. The subject line reading in full, Briggs Certification Contingency Plan. Arthur read the relevant portion aloud. His voice carried the same measured quality it had held all morning, not dramatically lowered for effect, not slowed for emphasis. Just the clean delivery of someone reading what was there. The text said, "If Briggs won't cooperate, we move to Plan B. I have a guy who handles document work. He's done this kind of thing before. Nothing traceable. We get Briggs's signature from a filed document. We replicate it on the certification transfer form. We submit to the registrar. Nobody audits these things once they're in the system." The room was quiet, not the recalibrating quiet from before. Something different. The quality of silence that happens when people in a room understand simultaneously that something has shifted and are waiting to see what it becomes. Vivian stood. "Objection! This email was obtained from a private server and the chain of custody—" "Your Honor," Arthur said, not raising his voice. "The email was obtained from Holt Construction's internal server by Mr. Cole Holt, who serves as field operations manager, and had authorized access to internal communications as part of his role. Chain of custody documentation is included in Exhibit 4, along with server access logs, showing Mr. Cole Holt's credentials were used to retrieve the file." "I'll review the chain of custody documentation," Judge Stanton said. "Objection overruled pending that review. Continue, Mr. Dean." Arthur moved to the second slide. This one showed a thread overview, the 7 emails between Marcus and Diana, spanning 3 weeks in September. The dates and subject lines visible, the content of each summarized in a single line. "The full thread," Arthur said, "establishes that the plan to forge Walter Briggs's signature on a federal professional certification was not an impulsive decision. It was discussed over 3 weeks, refined, and assigned to a specific individual described as a guy who handles document work. He looked at Judge Stanton. Forging a state-issued professional certification is a Class 4 felony under Arizona Statute 13-2001. Conspiring to do so carries the same classification. Vivian was on her feet again. Objection. Mr. Dean is characterizing conduct that has not been adjudicated. I'm describing what the emails say, Arthur said. The characterization is the statutes. Overruled, Judge Stanton said. She was writing now, her pen moving in the steady strokes of someone documenting rather than taking casual notes. I watched Marcus. The suit that had looked well-fitted that morning had somehow changed. Not literally, but in the way that clothing shifts when the person inside it changes. He was sitting very straight, the way people sit when stillness is a conscious effort. His hands were on his knees. The phone that had been in his lap earlier was no longer visible. Diana had not moved since Arthur began. She was looking at the screen where the email thread was displayed with an expression I couldn't fully read from across the room. Not surprise. Diana was too careful for surprise. But something had entered her face that hadn't been there during Vivian's presentation. A quality of calculation that was working harder than it had been running through something faster and with more urgency. Arthur moved to the final slide. It was a single line of text. The subject heading of the 7th email in the thread. Marcus to Diana, October 2nd. 3 weeks before the divorce filing. It read, "Problem resolved. Briggs is handled." Your Honor, Arthur said. Mr. Briggs was not handled. He declined to participate, declined to respond to further contact, and has been preparing to address this court directly since becoming aware of these proceedings 3 weeks ago. He turned from the screen. The attempt to subvert his certification and the forged signature on the LLC filing we discussed earlier constitute a coordinated effort to strip Mr. Holt of operational authority through fraudulent means. He paused. Which, as I'll demonstrate, has specific consequences under documents that Ms. Cross appears not to have reviewed. He moved back toward the defense table. Then he stopped and turned to look at Vivian. Ms. Cross, he said, his voice carrying the same measured quality as everything else. Nothing in it that could be called aggressive, just a question being asked. Would you like to explain to Judge Stanton why your client's son was planning to forge a federal professional certification? Or would you prefer I let Mr. Briggs do that himself? Vivian stood for the 3rd time. The objection she'd been preparing was visible in the set of her jaw, in the breath she'd drawn in, the way her hand had moved toward the documents in front of her. She held it for a moment. Then she said, "No objection, Your Honor. I reserve the right to cross-examine Mr. Briggs when called." She sat down. It was the first time since 9 o'clock that morning that Vivian Cross had answered a question with fewer words than she had available. Judge Stanton called the recess at 11:47. 20 minutes, she said. She had documents to review, and she wanted both attorneys at her bench at 2 o'clock to discuss scheduling for witness testimony. She gathered her materials with the economical movements of someone managing a day with more in it than the morning had suggested, and she disappeared through the door behind the bench without ceremony. The courtroom reorganized itself the way rooms do when authority leaves them. The bailiff moved to his station by the door. The court reporter saved her work and rotated her chair. In the gallery, the 3 people who had watched the morning session stood and stretched and checked their phones. Diana was already moving. She said something brief to Vivian, without turning fully toward her, the way you speak to someone when the words are for their ears and not their consideration. Vivian nodded once. Then Diana walked through the gate in the railing and into the gallery, toward the door to the hallway, not looking at me, not looking at Marcus, walking with the directional purpose of someone who has decided where they need to be and is getting there. Marcus followed, not immediately. He let 20 seconds pass, enough to establish that he wasn't following, and then he walked through the gate himself and out into the hallway. Which meant he was following, just with the 10-second delay of a man who thought the delay was sufficient cover. I stayed at the defense table. Arthur was beside me, reviewing his notes for the afternoon session, his pen moving in small annotations in the margin of his legal pad. He didn't look up when I turned slightly in my chair to watch the courtroom door. Cole had already gone. I hadn't seen him leave because I'd been watching Arthur. But when I turned to the gallery, the row directly behind my chair was empty. Cole's jacket was gone. The notepad he'd been using was gone. I looked at Arthur. He was still writing his annotations. I turned back to the table and waited. The 20 minutes passed in the particular way that recess time passes in a legal proceeding, too slow when you need it to be over, and too fast when you need more of it. Arthur went through his notes. I sat with my hands flat on the table and thought about the structure of what was coming the afternoon session. Walter on the stand, the certification provision, the 9B clause that Vivian hadn't found. I thought about the sequence of it, the order Arthur had chosen, and I understood again why he'd told me not yet that morning when I'd asked why he wasn't fighting. You don't win by fighting the structure while it's being built. You wait until it's complete. Then you show the court what it's built on. Cole came back through the courtroom door at 11:59. 1 minute before the recess ended. He was moving with the contained efficiency of someone who has done something that needed doing and is processing what it means. He came through the gate in the railing and sat in the row directly behind me. He leaned forward. They went to the far end of the hallway, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. The window alcove by the stairwell. I came around from the other side of the corridor and stood behind the support column. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the front of the room. Marcus got to her first, Cole said. He told her there was a problem with the accounts. Said the way he'd structured the transfers, some of the money hadn't gone where she thought it went. A pause. She asked him how much. Silence on my side of the conversation. I kept my hands flat on the table. He told her he'd needed a safety net, Cole said, in case the proceedings went sideways. He said he'd moved a portion into a separate account, his name only. Another pause, shorter. She asked again how much. He said it was substantial. She asked him to define substantial. Cole's voice dropped another register. He said it was most of it, Dad. Most of the 3.8 million. The room had the quality of held breath that sometimes comes over a space just before something happens in it. What did Diana say? I asked. Nothing, Cole said. For about 15 seconds. Then she said she wanted him to tell Vivian to settle. Take whatever the court was offering and end it today before the financial records went any further into the proceeding. And Marcus said he agreed. Cole paused. But he said it the way people agree when they've already calculated that agreement doesn't cost them anything. Like he'd already decided he was getting out regardless. A brief silence. Dad, I got it. I looked down at the table. My phone was in my jacket pocket, Cole said. Running since before I left the courtroom. The voice memo app. The microphone on that phone picks up clearly from 15 feet. He said it without pride, without drama. The same voice he used to tell me a beam calculation was within tolerance. A fact stated. 17 minutes of it. Arthur had stopped writing. He hadn't turned around. He was still facing front, his pen resting on the legal pad, his hands still. But the stillness was different from before. The stillness of a man who has just received information that changes the afternoon. I turned slightly toward him. He was already looking at me. May I hear it? He said. Cole handed his phone forward over the railing. Arthur took it, held it below the level of the table, and listened with an earpiece for 45 seconds. Then he removed the earpiece and handed the phone back. He turned to his legal pad and wrote 4 words at the top of a clean page. I read them upside down, the way you learn to read documents across tables when you spend enough time in rooms where documents matter. The 4 words were, he stole from her. Arthur underlined it once. The bailiff knocked twice on the door behind the bench. Court was reconvening. I looked at the door through which Diana and Marcus would re-enter, and I thought about 35 years of building things, and the particular lesson that 35 years teaches you, which is that the structure that fails most completely is always the one built on the assumption that nobody is paying attention. Marcus had built his safety net on that assumption. He'd forgotten about my son. The door opened. Diana came in first. Then Marcus, 2 steps behind her, in a navy suit that fit perfectly and meant nothing. And whatever he'd said to her in the window alcove by the stairwell had settled between them in the way that certain words settle, taking up permanent residence in the space between 2 people, and changing the geography of it permanently. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. Cole leaned forward one more time. "Dad," he said quietly. Marcus didn't route the money to the LLC. He routed it somewhere else. A pause the length of a breath. Mom doesn't know. I looked at the front of the room where Judge Stanton was taking her seat. "I know," I said. Judge Stanton settled into her chair with the efficiency of someone returning to work rather than returning to ceremony. Gathered the documents she'd been reviewing during the recess into a precise stack and looked at Arthur. "Mr. Dean," she said, "you indicated before the recess that you had additional evidence to introduce." "I do, Your Honor." Arthur stood. "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 7, an audio recording obtained by Cole Holt during the recess period in the public hallway outside this courtroom." Vivian was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "Objection, Your Honor. Any recording made without the knowledge and consent of all parties violates Arizona's wiretapping statute, 13-2422. Arthur didn't turn toward her. He addressed Judge Stanton directly. "Your Honor, Arizona is a one-party consent state for recordings made in locations where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. The hallway outside this courtroom is a public corridor in a government building. The conversation in question took place in an open alcove adjacent to a public stairwell, audible to anyone within 15 feet. He set a single page on Judge Stanton's bench. "This is an opinion letter from the Arizona Attorney General's office, issued in 2017, confirming that public hallways in government buildings do not constitute spaces where a reasonable expectation of privacy exists." Judge Stanton read the letter. Vivian remained standing, with the specific posture of an attorney holding an objection she already knew wasn't going to land. "Objection overruled," Judge Stanton said. "The recording is admissible. Proceed." Arthur connected Cole's phone to the courtroom audio system through the laptop Cole had set up that morning. The setup took 40 seconds. The room was very quiet during those 40 seconds. Then the recording began. Marcus's voice came through the courtroom speakers, with the particular quality that ambient recordings carry slightly compressed the background hum of the building, audible beneath it. A realness that studio recordings don't have, because they've had the world edited out of them. This had the world in it. A door closing somewhere. The distant sound of an elevator. 2 voices in a tiled corridor. Marcus said in the recording that there was something she needed to know about the accounts. His voice had the controlled urgency of someone delivering bad news to a person who is going to react badly to it and is trying to manage the reaction in advance. Diana's voice when it came was what I'd expected. Flat, precise. The voice she used when she was thinking faster than she was speaking. She asked how much. Marcus said he'd needed a safety net. He said the legal risk had been higher than projected, and he'd made a decision to protect a portion of the funds in a separate structure. She asked again how much. He said most of it. The silence on the recording lasted 11 seconds. I counted. The kind of silence that has texture to it, that you can hear the weight of, that tells you everything about the person sitting inside it. Then Diana said she wanted Vivian to settle. Today. Whatever the court would accept. The recording ended. The courtroom had the quality of a space in which everyone has just heard something they can't unhear. The atmosphere that follows certain revelations. Not loud, not dramatic, simply altered. The room that existed before the recording was not quite the room that existed after it. I looked at Diana. She was sitting with both hands on the table in front of her. Her right hand held a pen. The pen was a good one, the kind she'd always bought, weighted correctly, the cap posted on the back. Her fingers around it were white at the knuckles. She was not looking at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the table in front of him. He had the quality of someone who has understood, in the 45 seconds of a recording, that the geography of his situation has changed entirely, and that none of the maps he'd been using apply to the new terrain. Arthur moved to the defense table and picked up a folder. He carried it to Judge Stanton's bench. "Exhibit 8, he said. Forensic handwriting analysis of the signature appearing on the LLC filing entered as Exhibit 1 by Ms. Cross this morning." He set the folder on the bench. "The analysis was conducted by Dr. Patricia Solis of the Southwest Forensic Document Laboratory, who holds certification from the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners. Dr. Solis's preliminary finding rendered yesterday afternoon upon review of a high-resolution scan of the document is that the signature attributed to Raymond Allen Holt on page 3 of the LLC filing is a traced forgery, not a freehand imitation. The base signature used for tracing was taken from a notarized document filed with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office in 2019. Vivian stood. Her voice had the quality of an attorney making the argument she was required to make, rather than the one she believed in. "Objection, Your Honor. Preliminary finding. Dr. Solis has not yet completed her full analysis." "Noted," Judge Stanton said. She was reading the folder. "Mr. Dean, when will the complete analysis be available?" "Dr. Solis can deliver a complete report within 5 business days, Your Honor. We can make her available for testimony at the court's convenience." Judge Stanton set the folder down and looked at Vivian. "Ms. Cross," she said, "the LLC filing is the foundation of your client's claim regarding the voluntary transfer of operational authority. If that document contains a forged signature, your entire argument rests on fabricated evidence." Her voice carried no particular inflection. She was stating a condition, not making an accusation. "Does your client wish to respond to the forgery allegation?" Vivian turned to Diana. Diana looked at Vivian for a long moment. It was the look of someone calculating the available options and finding the list shorter than they'd expected. Then Diana looked down. It was a small movement. The lowering of the eyes by perhaps 30 degrees for perhaps 3 seconds. Nothing that would read as dramatic from a distance. But I'd been watching Diana's face for 30 years, and I knew what that particular downward angle meant. It meant the calculation was done, and the result wasn't what she'd needed it to be. Vivian turned back to Judge Stanton. "Your Honor, we request a brief continuance to review the forensic findings." "You'll have until 2 o'clock, Judge Stanton said. "We're in recess." She didn't reach for her gavel. She simply stood, gathered her materials with 2 precise movements, and walked through the door behind the bench. Arthur returned to the defense table. He set down the folder he'd been carrying and picked up a second one from the stack he'd prepared. This one was thicker, its tab unmarked, and he set it beside his legal pad with the careful placement of something being positioned for later use. I looked at it. He saw me looking. "Not yet," he said. The hallway outside courtroom 4 had the particular quality of a space that has been used hard all morning and is now being asked to absorb something it wasn't designed for. People moved through it the way people move through courthouse hallways during recesses, with the contained urgency of those who have things to discuss and limited time to discuss them. Attorneys with their heads together. A clerk moving quickly with a folder under her arm. An elderly man on a bench near the elevator, who had been there when we arrived that morning, and showed no sign of going anywhere. I stood near the window at the corridor's end with Cole beside me, and watched Diana work her way toward Vivian Cross. She covered the distance between them with the directional efficiency that had always characterized the way she moved through rooms where things needed to happen. No hesitation in the path, no concession to the people she passed. She reached Vivian at the far wall near the water fountain and positioned herself so that the conversation was private without being conspicuous. The instinct of someone who had spent 30 years managing how things appeared from a distance. Vivian listened. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the speaking, but the listening. In the morning session, Vivian Cross had been the person doing the talking, while others received what she said. Now she was the one receiving, and the way she held herself while she did it was different from the morning. The compressed energy that had characterized her all day had shifted slightly, like a building that has taken a load it wasn't entirely prepared for and is distributing the weight to find the new equilibrium. She said something back to Diana. Diana responded. Vivian looked at the floor for a moment, which was the first time I'd seen her look at the floor all day, and then looked back up and said something else. Diana's head moved in a way that wasn't quite a nod and wasn't quite a dismissal. The ambiguous movement of someone who has heard an answer that doesn't solve the problem. She turned away from Vivian. Marcus was waiting. He'd positioned himself 6 feet to Diana's left, close enough to be available and far enough to be deniable. The spatial grammar of a man who wanted to appear at ease and was working at it. When Diana turned from Vivian, she was facing him, which was either coincidence or calculation. And with Marcus, it was never coincidence. He said something. Diana looked at him. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was not a look I had a name for because it wasn't a look I'd seen before, and I'd seen most of the looks Diana had in her inventory over 30 years of marriage. This one was new. It had the quality of a door closing, not in anger, not in grief, but with the finality of a mechanism completing the action it was designed for. A lock engaging, a seal forming. She walked past him without responding. Marcus stood in the hallway with his hands at his sides and watched her go. He had the look of a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on is thinner than he'd measured it. Cole was beside me watching the same scene. She's done with him, he said quietly. Yes, I said. That's not what winning looks like. I looked at my son. He was watching the hallway with the careful attention he gave job sites, noting what was there, cataloging what it meant. He was 30 years old, and he was good at his work, and he understood structure, and he'd been watching his parents' marriage come apart for 11 months without saying most of what he knew about it. No, I said. It's not. Cole turned to look at me. Are you okay? It was the question children ask parents when the situation has reversed, when the child has grown into someone capable of carrying weight and has noticed that the parent is carrying more than is good for them. Cole had never asked me that before. Not in those words, not in that tone. I thought about how to answer it honestly. I built 35 years with that woman, I said. I know what she did. I know why we're here. None of that changes the fact that it was 35 years. I looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the Phoenix skyline visible in the distance, the desert city I'd been building in since before Cole was born. When something you built comes down, it doesn't matter why it comes down. It still comes down. Cole was quiet for a moment. She made her choices, he said. She did, I said. That doesn't mean I have to pretend the years weren't real. We stood at the window for a moment without speaking. Somewhere in the building below us, the ordinary work of the court system was continuing. The endless processing of human disputes through the mechanism of law. Each case, its own private catastrophe to the people inside it, and a file number to everyone else. Marcus had moved to the bench near the stairwell and was sitting with his phone in his hands, looking at the screen with the focused attention of a man trying to appear occupied, rather than a man who actually has somewhere to be. Vivian came down the hallway toward the courtroom door, her documents organized under her arm, her reading glasses back on their chain. She walked with the competence she'd carried all day, but the energy beneath it had changed. The morning's compression was gone, replaced by something more deliberate. The careful movement of someone navigating terrain they're no longer fully confident they've mapped correctly. She reached the courtroom door without looking at either of us. The bailiff opened it for her, and she went in. I looked at Diana, who was standing near the elevator at the far end of the corridor, one hand resting on the wall beside the call button, looking at nothing in particular. She was 60 feet away, and she was wearing the charcoal suit she'd bought because someone told her she looked authoritative in it. And she was standing in a courthouse hallway on a November afternoon, 35 years after we'd started building something together. And whatever she'd planned for this day, this wasn't it. She turned and saw me looking. We looked at each other across 60 feet of courthouse corridor for perhaps 3 seconds. Then the elevator arrived, and she got on without looking back. "Dad," Cole said. "It's time." The bailiff was at the courtroom door. I turned from the window. Marcus had stood up from the bench. He was walking toward the courtroom, his phone in his jacket pocket, his suit jacket buttoned, his face composed into the careful neutrality of someone who has decided that performance is all that's left. He reached the door and went through it without looking at either of us. Diana came back from the elevator a moment later, which meant she'd stepped on and stepped off without going anywhere. Just needed 30 seconds alone with the doors closed. She walked past Cole and me toward the courtroom door, with her eyes forward and her hands steady, and her shoulders carrying the particular set of someone who has decided to finish what they started, regardless of what it costs. I followed her in. Cole fell into step beside me. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Walter Briggs was in the gallery, and the unmarked folder on Arthur's table was still closed. Arthur said, "The defense calls Walter Briggs." The gallery door opened. Walter came in the way he did everything, without hurrying, without theater, with the deliberate economy of motion that belongs to men who have stopped performing for rooms and have been doing it long enough that they've forgotten they ever did. He was wearing the same canvas work jacket he'd had on in Tucson, the corduroy collar, the pockets he'd checked before leaving the house. His cane was in his right hand. His left hand was free. He walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the careful, unhurried pace of a man who had learned to respect what his body required without resenting it. And every person in that room watched him make the 40 feet from the door to the witness stand, because there was something in the quality of his movement that made watching unavoidable. I didn't look at Diana when Walter entered. I looked at the front of the room, at Arthur, standing beside the podium at Judge Stanton, following Walter's progress, with the neutral attention she gave everything. I let my peripheral vision do what it had been doing all day, keeping track of the edges of the room without announcing the surveillance. What I saw in my peripheral vision was Diana's hands. They were on the table in front of her flat, the way they'd been positioned when she was composed and calculating. Then, in the 3 seconds it took Walter to walk past the plaintiff's table toward the witness stand, her right hand moved. A small movement inward, the fingers curling slightly toward the palm. Not a fist, something more involuntary than a fist. The instinctive contraction of a hand that has just received information the rest of the body hasn't processed yet. She knew who he was. The bailiff administered the oath. Walter's voice when he said the words was steady and unhurried. The same voice he'd used all morning. The voice of a man who didn't modify himself for occasions. He sat. Arthur approached. "Mr. Briggs," Arthur said, "please tell the court your professional background." Walter looked at Judge Stanton rather than Arthur when he answered, which was the instinct of someone who understood that in a bench trial, the audience that matters is singular. "I hold a license in structural engineering from the state of Arizona," he said. "License number 47-219, issued in 1971, and maintained in continuous good standing until my retirement in 2003. During my active practice, I performed structural certification work for residential and commercial construction projects across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. I certified the work of approximately 240 contractors over the course of my career." "And did you have a professional relationship with Holt Construction Group?" Arthur asked. With Raymond Holt, Walter said. The distinction matters, as I'll explain. I began certifying Mr. Holt's work in 1989 and continued doing so for 14 years through his final project, with my certification in August of 2003. Can you describe the circumstances of that first certification? Walter looked at his hands for a moment, the way people look at their hands when they're locating a memory that's stored in the body rather than the mind. It was July, he said. A residential project in Chandler. 4-bedroom standard construction. Nothing unusual about the specifications. What was unusual was the contractor. Mr. Holt was 30 years old. He had a crew of 3 men and equipment that was adequate, but not new. He'd underbid the job, which I could tell from the timeline he was working against, but he hadn't cut anything structural to compensate for the budget pressure. Walter's hands settled. I walked the site for 2 hours. Every connection, every anchor bolt, every load path from the roof slab to the foundation. The work was correct. Not just within code. Correct. Did you certify the project that day? I did. But I asked him a question first. Arthur waited. I asked him what he thought a building was supposed to do for the people inside it, Walter said. I'd been asking contractors that question for 18 years at that point. Most of them answered in terms of specifications. Square footage load tolerances, material grades. Mr. Holt said he thought a building was supposed to make people feel like the ground under them was solid. Like whatever came at them from outside the structure itself would hold. He paused for exactly the right length. I certified his work that afternoon on the hood of my truck in 110-degree heat, and I kept certifying it for 14 years. Because in 14 years, he never gave me a reason to believe he'd changed his answer to that question. The courtroom was quiet, in the way it gets quiet when something true has been said, in a room designed for argument. Judge Stanton was writing. Vivian's pen was on the table in front of her, not in her hand. Arthur moved to the next question. Mr. Briggs, were you contacted by anyone regarding the Holt construction certification prior to these proceedings? Yes, Walter said. By whom? Diana Holt. He said the name without hesitation, without emphasis, the way he said everything. She called my home number in May of this year, a number I don't publicize, which told me she'd done some work to find it. What did she want? She wanted to know whether the certification could be transferred. Specifically, she asked whether my signature could be applied to a certification for a Marcus Webb, whom she described as the incoming operational head of Holt Construction. And what did you tell her? Nothing, Walter said. I didn't return the call. She called again, twice more. A law office the second time. I didn't return those either. Arthur let the silence sit for a moment, the way good attorneys let silence do work that words can't do as efficiently. Why didn't you return the calls? Arthur asked. Walter looked at the front of the courtroom for a moment before answering. Because in 40 years of certifying work, he said, I learned one reliable indicator of a problem. When someone asks about transferring a certification before they've spoken to the person named on it, they already know the answer that person would give, and they're looking for a way around it. He settled his hands on the railing of the witness box. I didn't return the calls because I needed to understand what was happening before I decided what to do about it. And because I wanted to see something first. What did you want to see? Arthur asked. Walter looked across the courtroom. Not at Arthur. Not at Judge Stanton. He looked at the defense table at the man sitting behind it in a white Oxford shirt and the boots he'd been wearing to job sites since 1997. And his gray eyes held the particular quality they'd had in Tucson that morning. The quality of a man who has been paying attention for a long time and has finally arrived at the point where the attention pays. I wanted to see, Walter said, whether the man who built something worth being proud of was still the man who built it. He paused. He is, Walter said. I didn't return her call. I wanted to see that for myself before I said it to anyone else. Arthur let the silence after Walter's last answer run for 5 full seconds before he moved. It was the right call. Some things need the room to absorb them before you add the next layer. And what Walter had just said to a courtroom about a man he'd been watching for 35 years was one of those things. Judge Stanton had stopped writing. The court reporter's fingers were still. Even the building seemed to have paused in its ambient mechanical processes. The ventilation system, the distant elevator, the settling of concrete and steel that old buildings do throughout the day. Then Arthur stepped forward. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "you mentioned the certification agreement contains specific language regarding the transfer of operational authority. Can you explain what that language requires?" Walter shifted slightly in the witness chair. The adjustment of someone settling in for something precise. The agreement states that the certification is contingent upon the certificant maintaining sole operational authority over any enterprise operating under its provisions, he said. That phrase has a specific meaning. It means Raymond Holt must be the person making the operational decisions, not a board, not a successor entity, not a chief operating officer appointed without his knowledge or consent. Raymond Holt, individually, in practice, in fact. And what happens if that condition is not met? The certification is subject to review and potential suspension at the discretion of the certifying engineer. Walter's voice carried the same measured quality as everything he said. But there was something underneath it now, the particular firmness of a man speaking from authority that is entirely his own. I am the certifying engineer. The discretion is mine. Can you explain the practical implications for Holt Construction Group if the certification were suspended? Without my certification, Holt Construction cannot bid or operate under federal or state contracts in Arizona, Nevada, or New Mexico, Walter said. Currently, 14 of their active projects fall under that requirement. 8 federal contracts, 6 state. Combined contract value of $62 million. He paused. Suspension would also trigger review clauses in most of those existing contracts, which would allow the contracting parties to halt payments and potentially rebid the work. The effect on company valuation would be immediate and severe. Vivian stood. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating about contract terms he hasn't reviewed. The witness has been certifying construction contracts for 40 years, Judge Stanton said. He can speak to standard contract provisions. Overruled. Arthur continued. Mr. Briggs, have you taken any formal action regarding the certification prior to today's session? Yes. The room changed again with that single word. The way rooms change when a short answer carries more weight than a long one. At 8:05 this morning, Walter said, I filed formal written notice with the Arizona Registrar of Contractors, initiating a certification review for Holt Construction Group, citing credible evidence of unauthorized transfer of operational authority and coordinated attempts to fraudulently replicate my professional signature. The filing creates a state record of the review process as of today's date. Vivian was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Objection, Your Honor. This is a unilateral action taken outside these proceedings, without notice to opposing counsel, designed to prejudice my client's interests. The certifying engineer's right to initiate a review is contractual, Arthur said. It requires no notice to third parties. The contract is between Mr. Briggs and Mr. Holt. Overruled, Judge Stanton said. She was writing again. Continue. What is the status of the review? Arthur asked. Pending, Walter said. The review period runs 30 days from today's filing. If the court does not act within that period to clarify the operational authority question, I will proceed to full suspension. Marcus had been sitting in the gallery with the stillness he'd maintained since the recording was played. The careful immobility of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. But something moved now. not his body, his face. A shift in the set of his jaw, barely visible from where I sat. The movement of a calculation, completing in real time, and arriving at a number that was worse than the one he'd started with. He looked at Diana. Diana was looking at Walter. She was doing the mathematics of what she'd just heard. The same fast, precise calculation she applied to everything. And I could see from the set of her shoulders that the result was not what she'd planned for. She'd walked into this courtroom this morning with an argument built on an LLC filing and a certification she'd assumed she could acquire. The LLC filing had been exposed as a forgery. The certification had just announced its own pending suspension. Marcus leaned slightly toward her. He said something so quiet, it carried no further than her ear. She didn't respond, didn't turn toward him, didn't acknowledge the words at all, which was its own kind of response. Arthur said, "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Stanton looked at Vivian. "Cross-examination, Ms. Cross." Vivian stood. She approached the witness stand with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided to proceed and has made the decision knowing it's the harder of the available options. She stopped at the appropriate distance and looked at Walter with the professional neutrality of an attorney who has learned not to show juries or judges what she's feeling. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "you retired from active practice in 2003. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "So you have not performed structural certification work in 21 years. "I have not performed it for clients," Walter said. "I've continued to review structures independently for my own education." "But you have no current professional obligations, no clients, no active certifications other than this one." "That's correct." Vivian paused, the pause of an attorney building to a point. "Mr. Briggs, isn't it true that your certification of Holt Construction represents the only active professional relationship you've maintained since your retirement? That this is, in effect, the last significant professional act available to you?" She let the implication sit. The suggestion that Walter's appearance here was less about principle than about relevance. That a retired man with one remaining certification was protecting it the way people protect the last thing that makes them feel they matter. It was a precise attack. I'd watched enough negotiations over 35 years to recognize the move finding the human vulnerability in an otherwise invulnerable position and pressing on it until something gave. Walter looked at Vivian for a moment, not with offense, not with the defensive energy of someone who's been stung. With the same gray, measured attention, he gave everything the attention of a man who has spent 74 years watching what people do when they think they've found an opening. "That's correct," he said. "This certification is the only active professional relationship I've maintained since 2003. He paused. "It's active because I've kept it active. I review Holt Construction's public filings every year. I drive past their job sites when I'm in Phoenix. I've done it since 2003 because I signed a document that says the work is mine to watch." He settled his hands on the railing. "The agreement I signed in 1989 doesn't have an expiration date." He looked at Vivian. "Does yours?" he said. Vivian held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "No further questions, Your Honor," and walked back to the plaintiff's table. Walter stepped down from the witness stand. He moved past the plaintiff's table without looking at Diana or Marcus, past the defense table with a single brief glance in my direction that carried nothing theatrical, just the acknowledgement of a man who has done what he came to do and is settling into what comes next. He took his seat in the gallery with the careful movements of someone who has been sitting in a wooden chair for several hours and has made peace with it. Vivian stood before Judge Stanton could prompt her. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client regarding the certification review filing." Judge Stanton looked at her watch. 5 minutes, Miss Cross." Vivian turned to Diana. What followed was not a conversation. It was an assessment, conducted in voices too low for the room to hear, with the compressed efficiency of two people who understand that they are making decisions in the time available rather than the time they need. Vivian spoke, Diana listened. Diana said something. Vivian shook her head once, the small, decisive movement of an attorney telling a client what is true rather than what they want to hear. Diana looked at the table. Marcus had been watching from the gallery. He stood and moved to the gate in the railing, leaning toward Diana and Vivian with something urgent in his posture. The body language of a man who believes he has information that will change the calculation. Vivian looked at him with an expression I recognized from job sites. The look of a senior engineer encountering an unsolicited opinion from someone without the credentials to offer it. She said something brief. Marcus stopped leaning. He went back to his seat. Diana straightened in her chair. She said something to Vivian. Vivian wrote it down. "Your Honor," Vivian said. "We're ready to proceed." Judge Stanton looked at Arthur. Arthur picked up the unmarked folder from the defense table. He'd set it there that morning before the session began, and it had sat through Vivian's opening, and the photographs, and the email thread, and the recording, and the forensic analysis, and Walter's testimony, waiting with the patience of something that didn't need to hurry, because it had already done its work 18 months ago, and had been waiting ever since for the right moment to be useful. He carried it to Judge Stanton's bench. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 9, an amendment to Holt Construction Group's internal operating agreement filed with the Arizona Corporation Commission 14 months ago as part of a standard quarterly amendment package." He set the folder on the bench. Judge Stanton opened it. The document inside was 2 pages. I'd written it myself on a Tuesday afternoon 18 months ago at the desk I'd had since we moved into the Scottsdale Road building in 2003, on a day when the suspicion had become specific enough that doing nothing felt like a decision rather than an absence of one. I'd written it in the language I'd learned over 35 years of reading contracts, which is the language of precision rather than elegance. And I'd filed it in the ordinary course of quarterly business because the ordinary course was the only place to put something you needed to exist without being noticed until you needed it to be noticed. "Section 9, subsection B," Arthur said. "I'll read the relevant provision." He had his own copy. "In the event that operational authority over Holt Construction Group is transferred through fraudulent means, including but not limited to forgery of authorization documents, unauthorized formation of successor entities in the company name, or material misrepresentation to regulatory or judicial bodies, all operational assets, active contracts, licensing agreements, and business relationships shall automatically revert to the founding principal upon judicial finding of fraud. Said reversion requires no separate legal action and takes effect upon the court's finding." The room was quiet, not the recalibrating quiet from earlier in the day. Something more absolute. The quiet of a space in which the structure of an argument has just encountered the thing it was built to withstand and has not withstood it. Vivian was reading her copy. Her reading glasses were on. Her pen was in her hand. She read it the way she'd read everything all day, with the professional attention of someone looking for the objection, the flaw, the place where the language gave way. She read it twice. Then she set her pen down. She didn't have an objection. Diana had turned in her chair to look at the exhibit on Judge Stanton's bench. She couldn't read it from where she was sitting, but she could see the document, and she could see Arthur standing beside the bench. And she understood with the speed of someone who has been reading legal documents for 30 years that the folder contained something she hadn't seen before. Something that hadn't been in Vivian's preparation. Something that had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 18 months in the ordinary company of quarterly amendments, unremarkable, until this moment. She looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at her. The exchange lasted 2 seconds. It was the exchange of 2 people confirming something neither of them wanted to confirm. Then Marcus stood up. He stood up in the gallery, the way people stand up when the calculation they've been running has finally completed, and the result is one they cannot sit with. And he said loudly enough for the front of the room to hear clearly, "That clause wasn't disclosed in discovery. They can't just introduce an internal document that wasn't. Mr. Webb. Judge Stanton's voice carried the particular quality it reserves for moments when authority needs to be felt rather than argued. You are not a party to these proceedings. Sit down. Marcus sat. The room held the aftermath of it, the way rooms hold the aftermath of a sudden sound. Everyone slightly adjusted in their positions, recalibrated to the new configuration. Judge Stanton returned to the document. She read it with the thoroughness she'd given everything all day. And when she finished, she set it down and removed her reading glasses and looked at Vivian. Miss Cross, she said, your client's signature appears on the acknowledgement page of this amendment. Did she review its contents before signing? Vivian's answer took exactly 1 second longer than it should have. The amendment was filed as part of a standard quarterly package, Your Honor. My client signed the acknowledgement of receipt. Whether she reviewed each individual provision, the question, Judge Stanton said, is whether she reviewed it. Vivian looked at Diana. Diana looked at the document on Judge Stanton's bench. There is a particular quality to the moment when someone realizes they have signed something they did not read. It is not like discovering a mistake. It is like discovering that the ground you've been standing on has a property you didn't know about. Not that it has given way, but that it was always capable of giving way, and you've been standing on it for 18 months without knowing. Diana said nothing, which was its own answer. Vivian turned back to Judge Stanton. No, Your Honor, she said. I don't believe she did. Judge Stanton picked up her pen. She wrote for a long moment 3 lines. 4-5. The pen moving with the steady deliberateness of someone putting things into the record that will matter later. Then she set the pen down and looked at the room. I'm going to take a 30-minute recess, she said. When we return, I'll be issuing preliminary orders. She picked up the document Arthur had placed on her bench and held it for a moment, the weight of 2 pages of plain language that had been waiting 18 months to do exactly what it was doing now. Both counsel should be prepared to address the question of asset reversion under this provision. She reached for her gavel. The sound of it coming down was not loud. Courtroom gavels rarely are up close. They're smaller than you expect, and the sound is flatter, more businesslike than dramatic. But in the particular silence of that room on that afternoon, with Diana looking at her own signature on a document she hadn't read, and Marcus sitting with his hands on his knees, and Vivian arranging papers that no longer told the story she'd been telling all day, it was enough. Judge Stanton came back in at 4:17. The 30 minutes had felt longer than they were, which is what 30 minutes feels like when the thing you've been working toward for 11 months is on the other side of them. Arthur had used the time to organize his notes into the sequence he'd need for whatever came next. Cole had sat behind me without speaking, which was the right call. Walter had remained in the gallery, his cane across his knees, his eyes on the front of the room. Vivian Cross had spent the recess at the plaintiff's table with Diana, their heads together, the conversation visible in the movement of their hands over documents, in the back-and-forth rhythm of 2 people making decisions they hadn't planned to make today. Marcus had stayed in the gallery, separate from them, which told me everything about the geometry of what was happening on that side of the room. Judge Stanton settled into her chair, arranged her materials, and looked at the courtroom. I'm issuing the following preliminary orders, she said. Final disposition will be determined at a hearing scheduled for 30 days from today, pending completion of the forensic document analysis and any criminal referrals that may follow from today's evidence. She looked at her notes. Regarding the LLC filing, entered as Exhibit 1. Based on the preliminary forensic finding and the chain of custody documentation provided, this court finds sufficient cause to treat the signature on that document as potentially fraudulent. The filing is hereby suspended, pending the complete forensic analysis. The transfer of operational authority it purports to document has no legal effect as of this ruling. Vivian did not stand. Regarding Section 9, Subsection B of Holt Construction Group's internal operating agreement entered as Exhibit 9. This court finds that the provision is facially valid, properly executed, and applicable to the circumstances presented today. Pending final hearing, Raymond Allen Holt is reinstated as the operational authority of Holt Construction Group, effective immediately. Cole exhaled behind me. A single breath controlled the sound of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has found it safe to set it down. The Arizona Registrar of Contractors will be notified of this ruling, and the certification review initiated by Mr. Briggs this morning. The review period is stayed pending final hearing. Judge Stanton looked up from her notes. Furthermore, the evidence presented today regarding coordinated forgery of legal documents and the financial irregularities documented in Exhibit 7's audio recording is being referred to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for review. Mr. Webb, you are advised to retain criminal defense counsel before leaving this building. Marcus was very still. Court is adjourned until the final hearing. Both counsel will receive written orders within 48 hours. Judge Stanton reached for her gavel, then paused. She looked at me directly for a moment. The flat, professional gaze of a judge who doesn't editorialize from the bench. Then she brought the gavel down once, cleanly, and stood and walked through the door behind her. The room began to empty. Vivian gathered her documents with the efficient movements of a professional, completing a job that had not gone as planned, but was still a job, still requiring the same attention to completion as any other. She said something brief to Diana, shook her hand once, and left. Marcus stood in the gallery for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he walked to the aisle and out through the main door without speaking to Diana or to anyone else. The door closed behind him. Diana remained at the plaintiff's table. She sat with her hands in her lap, which was different from how she'd sat all day. The hands that had been positioned on the table, calculated and present, were now folded below the table's edge, out of sight. She was looking at the front of the room, at the empty bench where Judge Stanton had been sitting. I stood. I looked at her for a moment, across the empty center aisle of the courtroom. 35 years is a long time. Long enough to build something that matters. Long enough to forget sometimes that the building is not the same as the builder. That what you construct together is separate from what you are separately. And that it is possible to love the work and find that the person you built it with became someone you didn't recognize while you were looking at the work. I didn't say anything. She didn't look at me. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair and walked out. Cole was in the hallway. Arthur was beside him, briefcase in hand, the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done his job the right way visible in the set of his shoulders, without being visible in his face. He shook my hand once, firm and brief, and said he'd have the written orders reviewed by morning. Then he walked to the elevator. Walter was at the end of the hallway, near the window, leaning on his cane, looking out at Phoenix in the late afternoon. The sun had moved to the west side of the buildings, throwing long shadows across the streets below. Cole and I walked to where he was standing. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, watching the city. Then Walter said, "There's something I want to show you." He drove. He knew the way, which I hadn't expected but should have. He took the surface streets south and east through neighborhoods that had been built up and changed and built up again over the decades, the perpetual reconstruction of a desert city that never quite decided what it wanted to be when it grew up. The house in Chandler was on a street called Palo Verde Court, in a neighborhood that had been new in 1989 and was now simply established. The kind of neighborhood where the trees had grown tall enough to arch over the street, and the houses had been repainted enough times that they wore their age comfortably. The house was the third from the end. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, a back porch facing west. It looked exactly like a house that had been built right and had been standing for 35 years without requiring anything from the world except ordinary maintenance and the ordinary attention of people who lived inside it. We stood on the sidewalk in the late afternoon light and looked at it. "I come here every November," Walter said. "I've been coming since 2003. I park at the end of the street and walk past." He watched the house. The current owners repainted in 2015. Wrong color. But the structure is exactly what it was. He paused. Build it right, and it outlasts everything they throw at it. Cole was standing beside me, his jacket collar up against the November air, looking at the house I'd built before he was born. Before Holt Construction Group existed as anything other than a pickup truck and a cement mixer, and the belief that the work mattered. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and produced a document. Not the 1989 envelope this time. Something newer. The paper still bright, the ink still fresh. Folded twice. He held it out to me. I unfolded it. It was a certification agreement. New language, updated provisions. Walter Briggs's signature at the bottom, next to a line for mine. A 25-year term, renewable with a successor clause. I read twice to be sure I was reading it correctly. In the event of the primary certificant's retirement or voluntary transfer, certification authority shall pass to Cole Raymond Holt, subject to character review and standards verification by the certifying engineer. Said review having been conducted and completed to the certifying engineer's satisfaction as of the date of this agreement. I looked at Walter. I've been watching him for 3 years, Walter said. Every job site I could get to, every project report in the public record. The way he runs a crew, the way he handles a problem when it comes up at 2 in the morning and the client is calling and the weather isn't cooperating. He looked at Cole. He answers the same question the right way. I didn't need to ask him. I watched him answer it every day for 3 years. Cole was quiet for a moment. What question? He said. What a building is supposed to do for the people inside it, Walter said. I took the pen from my jacket pocket. The same pen I'd been carrying for 20 years. The one I used for contracts and letters of intent, and the occasional amendment to an operating agreement on a Tuesday afternoon. When the suspicion had become specific enough that doing nothing felt like a decision. I signed the document on the hood of my car, the same way Walter had signed the first one, 35 years ago, on the hood of his truck. Walter witnessed it. Then he folded it and put it back in his pocket, and looked at the house on Palo Verde Court in the last light of a November afternoon. There's one more thing, he said. About this morning, on the drive to Phoenix. Cole and I looked at him. I've been in Chicago since October, Walter said, visiting my granddaughter at Arizona State. He caught himself. My granddaughter, not grandson. Old habit. He looked at the house. I knew your schedule. Saskia gave it to me when she called. She said you drove past the office every morning on your way from the hotel, and that you sometimes stopped in the parking lot and sat in your car for a while before driving on. He paused. I went to the office parking lot 4 mornings before today. I watched you sit in your car and look at the building. A man looking at something he built that someone has taken from him. He was quiet for a moment. This morning, I decided I needed to know something that the emails and the documents and the testimony couldn't tell me. What did you need to know? Cole asked. Whether 35 years had changed him, Walter said. Whether building an empire had made him into the kind of man who stops seeing the people in front of him because he's too focused on the thing he's building. He looked at me. I watched you sit in that parking lot this morning and look at a building with your name covered by someone else's placard. And then I watched you drive to the courthouse. And I followed you. The November light was going flat and orange over the rooftops to the west. If you'd walked past that parking lot this morning, Walter said, if you'd gotten out of your car and gone straight to the courthouse and not stopped when you saw that padlock, not stood there for the time it takes to feel something before deciding what to do about it, I'd have known the answer. He set both hands on the top of his cane. A man who has lost the capacity to stop and feel what he's looking at has lost something. I can't certify. Cole looked at me. I looked at the house on Palo Verde Court, built in 1989 with borrowed equipment and a crew of 3, and a signature on the hood of a truck. Still standing. The trees in the yard taller than the house now. The porch facing west, the way I'd designed it, so the family could watch the sun go down. And inside, people who didn't know me, living their lives on the foundation I'd laid before they were born. Build it right. It outlasts everything they throw at it. And to you, wherever you are, when you're hearing this. Maybe you're driving somewhere, or working, or sitting in a quiet room trying to figure out what comes next. I built something for 35 years and came close to losing it to people I trusted. Not because I was careless, because I was looking at the work instead of the people around the work. The lesson isn't distrust. The lesson is attention. Pay attention to what people do over time, not what they say in the moment. The ones who show up when it costs them something. The ones who make the call you didn't ask them to make. The ones who drive 115 miles and stand in a parking lot 4 mornings in a row because they want to see something for themselves before they say it to anyone else. Those are the people worth building with. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Tell me what you're building. And if you know someone who's in the middle of something hard right now, share this with them. Sometimes the thing that holds is the thing you built before the storm arrived. Raymond Holt walked into a courthouse on a November morning, believing he had lost everything. He walked out, understanding that the things worth keeping cannot be taken by a signature or a padlock or a forged document. They can only be given away. He never gave them away. Neither did his son, who spent 6 weeks building a case in silence to protect a father who thought he was standing alone. Neither did a 74-year-old engineer who drove to Phoenix because a young man once answered a question correctly, and some answers are worth remembering for 35 years. Raymond Holt learned the hardest lesson a builder can learn. The people who betray you are almost always the ones you trusted to hold the weight. But justice has a longer memory than any liar. What is built right outlasts every storm sent to break it. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us what you are building. Subscribe to MaleRevenge for more stories of betrayal, patience, and justice. And remember, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord.